Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Tony Stark became Penny Parker's mentor? A special shout out to the original creator, Emily F.6. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Intern Penny popped the earbuds in her ears, pulling her hoodie up around her head and zipping it up. It was chilly for September, and she hurried out of school, waving to Ned with glove-covered fingers, and hurried down the street toward the subway station. Her scarf was wrapped tightly around her throat, and she struggled to hit the play button on her music app despite the fact that the gloves were supposed to work with touch screens. Ever since the bite, if the temperature dropped below the 50s, she was freezing. It was something she was still learning to live with. Her cell phone buzzed as she curled up in the seat in the corner of the subway train, and she pulled it out, using her teeth to pull off one glove to respond to the text from Aunt May after giving up on typing with the gloves on. May. I'll be home late tonight. Think you can fend for yourself for dinner? Penny. I have the internship until 6. I'll be fine. Pulling the glove back on, she leaned her head against the window, staring as they left the tunnel and traveled across town at speeds that made the buildings blur together. Thankfully, no one tried to speak to her that day. Some days she'd have to pretend not to speak English, or pretend she couldn't hear the men over her music. She rarely had too much trouble, though. She'd been riding the subway on her own for years. Tucking her backpack under her arm against the wall of the train, she unzipped just the side, glancing in and checking on the suit for the third time since she'd left school. It was a Friday, which meant no patrolling. Still, she wanted to make sure she had the suit just in case. She never knew what could happen. It was safer to have it close. It was a rough suit, sure. Basically a hoodie, sweatpants, and goggles. But it was all she had. Closing her eyes again, she shivered, tightening her scarf. The subway was colder than normal. It was only 52 degrees outside and they had the air conditioning on in the train. When the train stopped at her station, Penny jumped up, pulling her backpack on and hurrying out onto the platform with the other people getting off. She had to fight her way through the crowd, up the stairs, and onto the busy New York street, hands stuffed in her pockets, shivering as she hurried towards the tower that dominated the skyline. The wind bit at her, whistling as it made its way through the huge buildings, and she wondered if she had a heavier coat. Pulling out her pass, she held it up to the side door of the tower, listened for the soft beep, and then hurried inside to where it was only slightly warmer. The employee entrance was pretty deserted at this time of day, so she was able to hurry over to the elevator where she held up her pass to the keypad beside the elevator door, then took the elevator down to the intern floor. The intern floor, only half of which was solely devoted to interns, had a private lab where they all had workstations, and cubicles for all 5 of them. They all reported to a research and development employee who oversaw their work. The program was brand new, so there were still bugs to be worked out. Usually they worked on research projects, helped with research and development, or solved challenges passed down to them by Mr. Stark himself. Those were the hardest. Also the most fun. Sometimes they got to blow stuff up. Once they had been told to develop their own version of the Iron Man armor. They were 3 months into the internship, so they all knew each other pretty well. Penny was the youngest at 14, only a sophomore, and the only one from Midtown. Jessica, Lori, and Raj were all seniors, with Milo the only junior, all from various private schools in New York. All of them had applied through their respective school, and Penny hadn't quite been able to believe her eyes when she'd gotten the acceptance letter. She and May might have jumped around the living room, practically screaming and hugging. This was her chance. Her opportunity to get something really impressive on her resume. To get into Stark Industries, the place she'd always wanted to work, ever since Mr. Stark had come on the TV in her living room and said, "I am Iron Man." Of course, she'd applied to the internship before getting her powers, so it was just a tad bit more complicated, but not much. The internship was every Friday, so she had plenty of days to patrol. Taking one off wasn't a big deal, plus she could tell May the truth for once. Penny Parker. Just in time. Penny dropped her backpack off at her desk, leaving the scarf on but removing the gloves. She was freezing, Plus last night's patrol had led to a couple of nasty bruises that she'd rather not show off lest someone get the wrong idea. 4, she asked, adjusting her scarf and joining Jessica and Raj at one of the tables. New assignment. Using any resources in the internship lab, build a robot. Then fight them to the death. Penny laughed as Jessica read dramatically from the folder, glancing over at Lori and Milo who were already working at one of their stations. We have 2 weeks. Weren't you in your school's robotics club? Oh, yeah, but I dropped out to make room for the internship. I can help if you promise to look over my code. Jessica readily agreed, and the two hurried off to work, Raj breaking off to start his own project. Collaboration was highly encouraged among Tony Stark's interns. That had been one of the first things that their intern supervisor, Chad, who spent most of his time working in his own lab, had said. There were plenty of group projects and lots of opportunities to work together. Grabbing her own folder, Penny skimmed the materials then hurried over to the closet where most of the supplies could be found. Grabbing armfuls of boxes, they carried their supplies to the tables in the lab and began to work. The afternoon flew by as they worked, rock music blaring in the background. There was a stereo in one corner where they could play music, and in the other corner was a refrigerator filled with snacks and drinks that they were all welcome to partake in. No matter how much they ate, it was always fully stocked by the next time they met. By the end of the afternoon, Penny had finished her plans and had a pretty good idea of what she was going to do. At 6, they all headed out, the other 4 heading to the parking garage where they kept their cars, while Penny headed up to the main floor. It was supposed to rain later and Penny really wanted to get home before it started pouring. Excuse me, hey, you, Penny paused, turning to find a young woman dressed in heels and a pencil skirt staring at her. Juggling 2 coffee carriers with 4 cups each, what looked like 6 plastic bags, and a clipboard. Oh, sorry. Penny turned, adjusting her scarf. Geez, temp. The woman snapped. Pay attention, where were you even going? The girl frowned, glancing at the side door which was her ticket to getting home before the downpour. Home. Home, don't you read your email? She shook her head. What? The meeting. The woman stepped into her personal space, pushing both of the coffee carriers into her arms, then loaded her down with the bags too. It wasn't exactly heavy. She did have super strength after all. But it was awkward to try and carry everything at once. I don't, Penny tried, struggling to balance everything. Miss Potts is waiting for these in conference room A. What? Penny asked, feeling like she'd stumbled into a nightmare. Like she was in a play but couldn't remember any of her lines. Seriously? Look, take the elevator. She led Penny over by the elbow, swiped her own pass and hit the button to floor 82. The level that required Avenger-level access. Conference room A. I said all this in the email. The meeting is starting in less than 5 minutes, so you'd better hurry. Wait. I'm not, and then the elevator doors were closing. Shit. The doors opened to floor 82, and Penny took a hesitant step out into the hallway. There were no doors in the immediate vicinity, no signs or arrows. Groaning, she took right, doing her best not to jostle the coffees. They were hot. She could tell just from brushing up against one with her arm. But walking all the way to the edge of the hall, she didn't see any doors. There were keypads set into the wall, but no doors. She heard footsteps then, and her heart leapt into her throat. She wasn't even supposed to be up here, but she needed to get this stuff dropped off. There was some kind of big meeting going on and they needed this stuff and somehow, that was now her responsibility. She hurried in the direction of the footsteps, pausing when she turned the corner and nearly ran right into someone. I'm so sorry, she cried, jumping back and staring up at an unfamiliar face. Well, mostly unfamiliar. She might have seen him somewhere. Regardless, he stared down at her in confusion and some suspicion. Deciding to just bite the bullet, she spoke in a rush. Excuse me. Sir. Can you please help me? Sure, kid. What do you need? He asked, eyes straying down to the bags hanging from her arms. The lady down in the lobby told me to take this up to conference room A and she told me that I had to hurry and that the meeting started in 5 minutes, but I think she thought I was someone else because I don't think I'm even supposed to be up here, but I didn't want to just leave this stuff. She trailed off and the man smiled a little. Do you work here, kid? Yes. I'm an intern. Down in research and development mostly, he nodded. Alright. Hand me that. He reached out, taking one of the carriers that held 4 coffee cups. Oh, you don't have to, don't worry about it. Come on. I'll show you where the conference room is. Thank you so much, sir. He smiled a little. What's your name, kid? Oh, Penny, sir. Penny Parker. It's nice to meet you, Penny. I'm Clint. And, placing his hand on the keypad, he revealed a door that suddenly appeared in the wall, pulling it open with his free hand. Sorry I'm late, but I found the coffee. And some kid. Feeling her face flush, she took a step into the room, breath catching as her eyes went around the table. At the head, facing her, was Pepper Potts. The Pepper Potts, as in, her boss's 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 boss. Heck, there may need to be more rungs in that ladder. Standing beside the window was Tony Stark, who had just turned away from his conversations with Steve Rogers. Captain America and Iron Man were staring at her from the window of a secret conference room on a floor she wasn't even allowed to be on. Thor and Dr. Banner were sitting at the table, both looking curious, while the man with her handed a cup of coffee to a woman she didn't recognize but could guess was the Black Widow. Wanda Maximoff sat next to a man in a sweater she'd never seen before. And Falcon, whose name was Sam something, her brain refused to tell her at the moment, was beside Wanda at the table. They all just stared at her for a moment, their expressions mostly amused, and she wondered if she could ever walk into that building again. If she could ever show her face in New York after this. Then Captain America was hurrying forward, reaching out to take the coffee away from her. Here. Let me help you with that. And that snapped her right out of her trance. Oh, no, I'm so sorry, I can. She started to pull away when one of them finally tipped, pouring steaming coffee over her arm. She gritted her teeth, flinching as boiling coffee covered her arm, the fabric not doing much to save her arm. I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't. Okay. His voice dropped a little and he took the carrier away from her, placing it gently on the table. It's okay. You're not in trouble. Just set some of this down. Mr. Stark approached as Captain America and the other guy. Clint started taking the bags away, placing them on the table with loud thumps. They must have been heavy, Penny thought as her arm burned. Kid. Come here. Mr. Stark ordered, and, wondering if this was the day she lost her internship and got exiled from the country, she followed, face red, eyes hot. He led her through a door that led to a little kitchen, and she stood hesitantly in the doorway until he motioned for her to join him at the sink. Here. He soaked a cloth in cool water and she stood frozen until he finally looked up at her face. Hey, what's your name? Penny. She whispered, and he nodded, lips turning up into a smile. Penny Parker, youngest intern to ever be accepted to my program. This was the first year of the program, she pointed out with a watery smile. He chuckled, gesturing for her to hold her arm out. She did, and he carefully pulled the wet sleeve back to reveal her arm. And for a second, she saw him freeze. The red place on her arm wasn't too bad, just a minor burn from the coffee. But encircling her right was a still purple bruise from the night before. Thankfully she didn't have to take off her sweater and reveal the other bruises that she knew went up her arms. He didn't say anything, just pressed the cloth to her arm, then let her take over holding it. Iron Man had just touched her arm. So, wanna tell me what brings a research and development intern up to the Avengers floor? I'm so sorry, he waved a hand. It's fine, kid. You aren't in trouble. I'm just wondering how you got up here. Oh, so I was leaving and this lady was carrying all this stuff and she yelled at me and asked why I hadn't checked my email and where I was going, and I think she thought I was a temp because that's what she called me, and she gave me all this stuff and put me on the elevator and told me to bring this to conference room A. He lifted an eyebrow, shaking his head and chuckling. Well, I'm glad you turned out to be an intern and not a corporate spy. Mr. Stark nodded to her arm. You okay? Yeah, it was just kind of hot. I'm fine. He nodded slowly, eyes searching hers. What did you think of the robot challenge? She grinned a little. It's fun. Good. I'm going to have to pop down to see the death match. He took the cloth then, and watched as she pulled her sleeve back down. Are you cold? He asked, incredulous, gesturing to her scarf. Yeah, usually, she admitted, sheepish, and he hummed, clapping his hands. All right, intern Penny. Let's get you back to the appropriate floor. Right. I'm so sorry, sir. Not your fault, kid. I'll have Pepper talk to her assistants. We've had a mix-up or two with the temp agency." They stepped back into the conference room, and Penny kept her head down. "All right. Head back to the elevator. Friday will take you to the right floor. Thanks for bringing the coffee." "Yes. Of course, sir. Thank you." And with that, she hurried out of the room, wondering why she had thanked him. Maybe for not firing her or throwing her out the window. The next Wednesday she got a handwritten note of apology from Pepper Potts that thanked her for filling in on such short notice. She might have framed it. Impressions. Mr. Stark showed up in the intern lab as promised 2 weeks later, slipping into the room almost without being noticed. By that point, Penny had almost forgotten his comment about watching the robot fight. At their workstations, Lori and Jessica were putting the final touches on their robots while Milo and Raj carried their own robots over to the ring, having volunteered to go first. There was a small ring set up in the middle of the open space of the lab, a short wall made of thick, durable plastic encasing it. Raj stepped over the wall, placing his robot on one side, Milo following suit. Penny was perched on the counter on the other side of the ring. Her own little robot, smaller than the others, sat beside her. She was fine with going last, even though she was pretty sure that her robot, which she'd privately named Rey after the new Star Wars movie heroine, would have no problem taking down the other robots. She had a secret weapon. Jessica glanced over from where she'd been standing at the edge of the ring, her robot by her feet, but then the girl's eyes widened. Penny heard footsteps behind her then, and another heartbeat spinning a little in her seat on the counter. She felt her eyes widen as Tony Stark himself made his way over to her. Penny Parker. "Hey, Penny." He came to stand beside her at the counter, eyebrows lifting until she finally realized what he'd said. That he was actually speaking to her. Tony Stark had come into the intern lab and had just said hello to her. And he knew her name, and she still hadn't said anything. "Oh, hi, hello. Mr. Stark. You guys gonna battle to the death now?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the ring where Raj and Milo stood. "Yes, sir. You can drop the sir, Penny," he offered, giving her a brief smile before turning back to the other interns, all of whom were staring wide-eyed at them. "Hey, kids. Tony Stark." He pointed to himself. Jessica was the first to snap out of it, stepping forward. "Mr. Stark. Hi, it's such an honor to meet you." "Thank you." He nodded, casually, calm and collected. "I'm Jessica. Senior, focus on programming and web design. Nice robot." He held out a hand that she shook. "Nice to meet you, Jessica." He turned to Lori then, who jumped to introduce herself, then the boys. For each one, he'd apparently memorized their year in school and what they hoped to major in. After greeting everyone, Mr. Stark nodded toward the two robots already in the ring and waved a hand. "Well, are we going to have a robot fight or what?" And with that, it was on. Penny had never imagined that Mr. Tony Stark could look so relaxed spending time with a room full of interns watching robots destroy each other. The match between Raj and Milo went on for almost half an hour, the two robots outsmarting each other through their owners, racing around the ring, hidden attachments popping out and slamming into one another. When her stomach started growling, Penny went to the mini fridge and grabbed a soda and a protein bar, hopping up on the counter and watching as Raj's robot finally won. Next up were Lori and Raj. Lori lasted 10 minutes. Then Raj and Jessica, who lasted almost another half an hour, and, finally, Raj and Penny. The other robots were mostly destroyed, with Raj being the ultimate winner until Penny hopped off of the counter, pulling at her scarf so that the tail of it was at her back and wouldn't get in her way. Her gloves were thin enough that she could use the remote control, thankfully, because patrol the night before had been rough and at one point, she'd been up against 6 men attempting to break into a jewelry store. She'd won, but they'd gotten her with their baseball bats a couple of times. Raj's robot was kind of beat up next to Penny's much smaller one, but still functional. Jessica and Lori sat cross-legged on the floor on the sidelines to get as close a view of the action as they could, both with protein bars and bottles of water, while Milo stood behind Raj, getting a better look at his remote. Mr. Stark hadn't moved from where he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, looking as if he had nowhere he'd rather be. At first, everyone had been kind of nervous, but the man was calm, even seeming kind of excited to be watching the match, and the interns had collectively relaxed. Raj grinned down at her little robot, looking a little more patronizing than Penny was comfortable with. Still, she was ready to let her work speak for her. So the match began. Penny hadn't known that Mr. Stark would actually be in the room when she'd done the final design of her robot. She hadn't taken that into account at all, especially when she'd decided to use her web fluid. Of course, she doubted that Mr. Stark had ever heard of Spider-Girl. She wasn't exactly a real superhero. She helped old ladies carry groceries and gave tourists directions. And sometimes she stopped muggers and small-time gangs from breaking into local stores. That was how she got most of her bruises. The fights were several men with crowbars or baseball bats or just their fists ganged up on her. She had always won so far, but she worried that one day she wouldn't. Penny blinked hard as she stared into the ring at her robot as it battled Raj's. She needed to focus. Tony Stark was watching. At first, she stuck to moving the robot around the ring, easily escaping the attempted blows by Raj's larger, somewhat slower robot. And she watched his brow tighten, lips in a frustrated, firm line on his face. She knew that when it came down to it, she would have to use her secret weapon. So, after a blow from the larger robot that nearly knocked hers over, she hit the small red button on the side of her remote that shot a stream of webbing that immediately stuck his robot to the ground. "Hey!" Raj cried, and with a well-placed slice with a small saw attachment that was built into her robot's arm, his robot was out of commission. Lori laughed out loud and Jessica jumped into the ring to examine the stuff that had defeated Raj. "Cheater," Raj grumbled under his breath, and Penny clenched her jaw, stung. For a second, everyone was silent, the atmosphere suddenly tense. But before she could retort or even head back to her own work area to fume, Mr. Stark stepped forward, voice mild. "No room in this internship for sore losers, Raj." Stepping over the wall and kneeling beside Jessica, he reached out to touch the web fluid. "What do you think, Jessica? What did Penny use?" It's like webbing," Jessica murmured. Mr. Stark hummed under his breath, eyes cutting over to her before he nodded, reaching out to touch the stuff, pulling at it and rubbing it between his fingers. "Holy shit. Penny, did you get the idea from Spider-Girl? She uses webbing too?" Jessica asked, jumping up, eyes bright. Penny nodded, heart racing. She had an excuse ready, just in case someone asked about it, but had been hoping that no one would. "Yeah. I saw her swing by and saw the web." She trailed off, shrugging and smiling, trying to look self-deprecating. Like she hadn't come up with the formula in the first place. Like she wasn't dying to impress this man. "I got a sample and worked out the formula." "Impressive." Mr. Stark stood, crossing his arms and regarding her for a moment with a smile. "Good job, kid. You all did good." He looked around the room, eyes pausing on Raj. There was something in Mr. Stark's eyes. Caution, worry. No, she doubted it. She just must have read him wrong. "All right, I'd better get back to it. Pepper threatened to fire me if I miss another board meeting." Everyone chuckled, surprised that the man was joking around with them. "It's late. Go home. Good job today. The next intern challenge will arrive, whenever I think of it." With that, the man was leaving, taking long strides toward the elevator, then disappearing. Raj didn't look at her as he left, grabbing his stuff and all but storming out. She wanted to apologize, but she didn't have anything to apologize for. She hadn't broken any rules. She'd impressed Mr. Stark, which was exactly what she'd do. Sighing, Penny dragged her feet back to her desk, placing her robot on the top of the desk by the computer and pulling her jacket on. It wasn't the first time she'd been ostracized for showing up an older student, especially the guys who were always happy to have a younger girl in their clubs until she beat them. Milo filed out behind Raj, followed by Lori, but Jessica hesitated. "Hey, don't let him bug you. He's just jealous. You beat him, fair and square." Penny nodded, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Think you can show me how you made that webbing?" Yeah. I can show you the base formula. I had to play with it for a long time to get it to work." She didn't really want to risk sharing the formula. Then again, she guessed it wouldn't do any harm. It wasn't like Jessica had any superpowers. That she knew of, anyway. The internship usually went until 6, but it was nearly 7 now, and getting dark, and cold. She shivered as she made her way up the stairs and into the lobby, having skipped the elevator in favor of getting some exercise to try and warm up. Jogging up the last flight of stairs, She stepped into the lobby, headed straight for the employee exit at the side of the room, then stopped. It was pouring, and dark. She sighed, tucking her jacket more tightly around her shoulders and shivering. She hated winter, hated the constant cold and miserable rain and snow. All of it. But it did give her an excuse to cover up, which was pretty important considering the criminals she chased got a couple of hits in fairly regularly. Taking a step out into the pouring rain, she groaned, shivering once more and looking around. All around her, people with huge umbrellas hurried up and down the street, and she ducked her head, hurrying forward and racing in the direction of the subway station a few blocks away. She finally reached the subway platform, shuddering at the cold and wondering why she hadn't brought an umbrella. Honestly, she hadn't thought it would rain, or that she would be out this late. Her phone vibrated as she waited on the platform and she pressed it to her ear, realizing that she should have called her aunt earlier. Penny? Hey, May. I'm sorry, the internship ran late. I was worried. Penny. It's getting late, her aunt reprimanded. I know. I'm sorry. I was just about to call. It's pouring out. She changed the subject a little, hoping that might distract her aunt. Do you need a ride home? Penny shook her head, even though her aunt couldn't see her. I'm about to get on the subway, she promised. Are you alone? I'm fine, May. She told her aunt with a smile, then tried again. What's for dinner? With a sigh, her aunt informed her that dinner hadn't worked out and that she'd ordered pizza, which sounded great to Penny. She continued to shiver as she waited for her train, pulling her wet jacket more closely around her to no avail. It had been chilly for August, in the low 60s during the day, and everyone else seemed thrilled with the mild weather. But Penny wrapped her scarf around her neck a little tighter. Just as her train arrived and she stepped into one of the empty trains, her phone vibrated in her pocket. The subway car was almost empty except for a couple of guys sitting together, talking loudly on one side, so she sat in the corner as far away from them as she could get, pulling out her phone and frowning at the name on the screen. Tony Stark. She didn't have Tony Stark's phone number. Taking a deep breath and trying to stave off a panic attack, she answered, putting her backpack on the seat beside her so that no one would sit there. Hello? Penny Parker? The familiar voice asked. Yeah. Yes, sir, Mr. Stark, sir. There was a soft chuckle on the other line, and her cheeks caught fire. Hey, kid. Hi. Mr. Stark, just wanted to tell you that you did great today. Real impressive stuff. Next week, I want you to report to floor 79. I wanted to talk to you about the formula for that webbing. You said you got the idea from Spider-Girl. For what felt like a really long time, she couldn't respond. Her jaw had dropped, eyes huge as she stared straight ahead. Floor 79. She knew that number. Had practically gotten it tattooed on her forehead. Floor 79. Tony Stark's personal lab. Tony Stark wanted her to come to his personal lab. Never in her life had she ever dreamed that she would actually see the inside of his personal lab. It was crazy enough that she was an intern at his company, that she'd actually gotten to meet him. Now he wanted her to come to his lab. Penny, Fry, did the call drop? His voice came through again. Oh, no, I mean. Yeah, I saw her webbing and, she trailed off, glancing over at the men who'd moved 3 seats up. And, one of the men met her eyes and licked his lips, while his friend moved his hand towards his crotch. Flushing, she turned away, staring determinedly out the window at the dark walls passing by. Kid? Mr. Stark asked slowly, voice going soft and serious, is everything okay? Yeah, I'm just on my way home. Yeah? The man didn't sound reassured. Where are you? On the subway, she told him softly, pushing her shoulder a little closer to the window. She could take those guys. But not without giving herself away. Also, she didn't want to. She just wanted to go home. He was quiet for a moment, and immediately her brain told her to fill the silence. Anyway, I got the idea from her webs, so I played around with some formulas at school and was able to recreate her webbing. I don't think Raj was happy, though. Yeah? Did he say anything to you? She had to admit, she was kind of surprised at his tone, but she answered anyway, trying to shrug it off. Oh, no, she laughed a little. He completely ignored me. In the reflection of the window, she could still see those guys staring at her. She didn't want to hang up the phone. But she decided that when the call was over, she'd just call Ned. He'd talk to her until she got off the subway. Or maybe she'd get off the subway and take another way home. "I think he's mad," she told him, hearing the sadness in her voice and shaking her head. "Anyway, it was a really cool challenge, Mr. Stark." Acting like she's talking to Tony Stark, one of the guys told the other, speaking loudly enough that she thought Mr. Stark might have heard. Face heating up again, she held the phone a little tighter. His friend chuckled. "Hey, sweetheart. Wanna come talk to us instead? You live in Queens, right?" Mr. Stark asked, his voice almost flat. "Oh, yeah. Yes, sir." "The sir isn't necessary, kid, remember?" the man's reminded her, almost gentle. "Oh, right, sorry," she muttered, glancing over at the men in the reflection of the window once more. They were still staring. "How long does it take you to get home after the internship?" Like an hour. Usually, depending on whether or not my train is on time." He hummed again, not sounding happy about that. "Everyone else drives, so it probably doesn't take them as long. But I think they all live closer to the tower. Not that I know. I never asked them where they live, but I think Lori lives pretty close," she rambled, cursing herself for rambling. Sorry," she mumbled. "Nothing to be sorry for, kid," he told her softly. "Do you want me to stay on the phone?" She felt her jaw drop, fingers clenching around the phone. He was offering to stay on the phone with her? Tony Stark? This was definitely his voice. Right? Oh. Mr. Stark, you don't have to do that. I'm sure you're really busy. Nah, he said, voice casually dismissive, and she had to smile a little. Board meeting's over. That was a really short board meeting. Realizing what she'd just said, she started to apologize, but he chuckled. "Yeah. I might have ducked out early. So, you saw Spider-Girl and decided to reverse engineer a formula?" She watched the tunnel flash by, the only light coming from the weak bulbs overhead that constantly hummed at a high pitch, the stress from her fellow passengers giving her a building headache. Yeah. I saw her swinging by and I was just wondering if her webs were organic or if she made them or… Well, I saw her wrists and she had these, web shooting things. So I got a sample, but they dissolved after a couple of hours, so I just started playing around with some of the formulas." So, was this school-sanctioned research? She would have been more embarrassed if it hadn't sounded like he was smiling on the other end. Not exactly," she admitted. "But I got all of my other work done first, somehow." Over the last few minutes, she'd almost forgotten that this was Tony Stark on the phone. "Tony Stark, anyway, I should let you go, Mr. Stark." The man hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, all right, kiddo. Just, if you need anything, call, okay? Can't have one of my interns." He cleared his throat, sniffing. "Anyway, have a good night, kid. Stay safe. I'll see you on Friday." "Thank you, Mr. Stark," she told him, standing from her seat, moving over to the door as they approached the next subway stop, making sure to give those men a wide berth. She wasn't about to spend another minute on this train with those guys staring at her. Hanging up the phone, she hurried onto the mostly empty subway platform as soon as the train stopped, leaving the guys behind. It wouldn't be the first time she'd had to find an alternate way home because some guys were harassing her. But these guys had been some of the most aggressive. Usually, they just catcalled her a couple of times or sat too close. Every other time, there had been more people on the train too. Pushing the thoughts of them away, she climbed the stairs to the street, shivering immediately when the cold air hit her, rain soaking her almost instantly. Penny ducked into an alley, looking around to make sure no one was around to see her, then started to pull her clothes off, starting with her scarf and gloves, folding them carefully and putting them in her backpack, then her sweatshirt and t-shirt, then her jeans, leaving her shivering in an undershirt and underwear. Thankfully it was dark, and her senses could always tell her if anyone got too close to seeing her change. Yanking on her suit, she wished for the 1000th time that she had a portable heater or something. Or that she'd made her suit out of waterproof material. Her suit. That was kind of a joke. It wasn't much of a suit. It was a pair of blue sweatpants and a blue sweatshirt, a red sleeveless hoodie. It did very little to keep her dry, but as she pulled the mask over her head and then pulling the goggles over her eyes, everything was instantly a little darker. and a little more focused. The overload that she had learned to live with dampened, and it was like she could breathe a little easier, her headache already starting to recede. Strapping her web shooters onto her wrists, she stuffed her clothes into her backpack, placing her hands against the brick wall beside her and began to climb. She moved quickly, fingers gripping a little less because of the water that poured down the side. She was used to it though, she'd done plenty of patrolling in the rain. Pulling herself up to the roof easily, she stood, looking at the rain as it poured down onto the concrete buildings as far as her eyes could see. Shooting a web at the closest building, she leapt, feeling her heart flip, her whole body suspended in freefall before she shot another web and swung. It took her a little longer to swing home than it did to take the subway, and when she finally reached the alley beside her building, she changed out of her suit and back into her normal clothes, shoving the suit into the plastic bag she kept in her backpack for that very reason, then hurried up the stairs to her apartment. Unlocking the door, she found herself immediately pulled into May's arms. "Baby, you're freezing." May rubbed her arms up and down her arms, and soaked. "Why didn't you take an umbrella?" "I forgot," Penny admitted, shivering and keeping the scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, even though it, too, was wet, and hadn't done much to keep her warm. She really would have to remember to keep an umbrella in her backpack from now on. Her aunt pulled away, placing a hand on her cheek and giving her a gentle smile. "All right, baby. Go take a hot shower and get into some dry clothes before you catch a cold," she ordered, shooing Penny off. "The pizza should be here in a few minutes." Penny stripped in the bathroom, getting a good look at herself in the mirror and smiling in relief. Almost all of the bruises were gone. Spider-Girl. Spider-Girl swung from rooftop to rooftop, releasing one web and free-falling for almost too long before catching herself at the last minute, almost able to feel her feet skim the sidewalk. She was warm thanks to a dry suit and the sun shining down. She released one web at the top of her arc, flipping and then free-falling, then shooting another web. It was her favorite. Fighting crime was great. Saving people was her responsibility. But swinging through the city, it felt like flying. Like a dream come true. She closed her eyes, letting herself freefall, and fall, and fall, until the last possible second. Then she shot another web. Flying through the air, swinging, falling, swinging, falling, falling, falling. She loved falling. She loved flying, flipping and landing on her toes on a rooftop. She crouched, fingers splayed, sweeping the city with her eyes. It had been a quiet Monday afternoon. She'd saved a girl from a mugger and had stopped a man from breaking into a car. Okay, to be fair, it had been his car, but he had looked shady, so she'd webbed him to the ground. And she didn't have anything to dissolve the webs on her at the moment. So she'd apologized and left him there. The webs would dissolve after an hour or two. She shook off the guilt, crouching on the rooftop and keeping an ear out for any crime she could stop. Muggings, break-ins, drug deals. She tried to stop as many of them as she could. She owed her uncle that much. But for the most part, she found herself giving people directions, helping the elderly with their groceries, and doing tricks for kids. She told herself that these things were helping too. An almost familiar sound jolted her out of her thoughts and she looked up to find a figure flying overhead, then hovering over the rooftop behind her. She straightened out of her crouch, shoulders stiff, hands clenched behind her as Iron Man slowly lowered himself onto the roof, the metal faceplate covering his face, two little slits in the mask lit up and staring at her. Her stomach clenched and her jaw tightened under the mask. "Spider-Girl?" he asked. She felt frozen. The mask flipped up then, revealing the face of Tony Stark. "Spider-Girl?" he repeated. She nodded, almost against her will. "Nice to meet you finally." He knew her voice. She just talked to him a couple of days ago. There was no way she could talk to him now. He'd recognize her voice in a second. "So, nice suit." She didn't move, feeling her cheeks heat up under the mask. Of course, he would think her suit was dumb. He built amazing things out of metal and, well, scraps at first. Then, well, he was rich. She was. Okay, they weren't poor. But they weren't well off, not by a long shot. So there was no way she could secretly find and buy materials for the kind of suits she'd drawn up in secret notebooks. You don't talk?" he asked, hesitant, as if afraid to offend. Not seeing another option, she shook her head, then, wondering if she was going to hell, she pointed at her ear, making the sign for deaf, and silently thanking the universe that her grandfather had been deaf and that she'd grown up learning sign language with him. He died when she was 9, but she still remembered enough to get by thanks to the occasional practice she'd gotten with her neighbors on the 3rd floor who had a deaf son. Of course, she wasn't exactly fluent, but she was willing to bet that Tony Stark didn't know sign language. His eyes widened and her stomach clenched, the guilt overwhelming his concern, then guilt of his own filled his face. "Oh, I'm sorry." He signed the word for sorry, one of the ones she thankfully knew, and she flashed him an "okay," waving off his apology. He slowed down, moving his hands that were covered in metal gauntlets, signing about every other word. "I'm Tony Stark." She nodded, fighting a smile when he spelled out his name. "As if anyone didn't know that. I saw you on YouTube." He spelled YouTube clumsily, metal-covered fingers moving slowly. His hands flailed for a moment, and then he pointed to his own wrist, miming shooting a web. "Webs." He said the word, and she laughed, flipping her wrist over and showing him her web shooter. He came a little closer, holding out a hesitant hand before getting a closer look at the web shooter. "Did you do this by yourself or?" He glanced up, then backtracked when she was silent. "Right. You make?" he asked, pointing at her and then at the device on her wrist. She nodded, guilt sitting like a rock in her stomach. "And he mimed something coming out of the web shooter and she smiled again under her mask at the effort." Penny nodded again, reaching into a pocket to pull out an extra cartridge of web fluid that she held out. "Thanks," he told her, using the sign as well, and she nodded, watching him examine the fluid with a flutter in her stomach. This was possibly the smartest person in the world. Or, if not the smartest, he was in the top 10. And he was examining her original web fluid. Heart racing, she watched a smile bloom on his face. "That's incredible," he murmured, and she felt her cheeks burn, glad that the mask hid his face. Apparently lacking the ability to sign what he was feeling, he gave her a thumbs up. Penny waved him away when he went to hand it back, pointing to him and using the sign for keep. He pointed at himself, eyes wide in surprise. I can keep it?" he asked, finger against his own chest, and then at the web fluid. She gave him the sign for yes, and the smile came back, this one surprised. "Grateful. Thank you," he signed again. Afraid that she was pushing her luck, and also ridiculously guilty that she was pretending to be a deaf superhero, she waved, then turned and stepped off the room, fighting back her laugh at the shout of surprise that followed her. Waiting until the last minute, she shot a web, then swung a convoluted path through the city, hopefully losing him. She didn't see him around anywhere, but she still circled her apartment 5 times before climbing in through her window, ripping off her mask and dropping onto her bed, hand on her chest as she caught her breath. That had been close. Also morally questionable. Still, just in case, she pulled up a playlist on sign language on YouTube and prayed that there were no videos of her on YouTube talking. Figuring that New York didn't exactly pay too much attention to her, she resolved to be quieter while fighting crime. And also to maybe start a few rumors on the message boards that Spider-Girl was deaf. Thankfully there were only a handful of videos of her on YouTube, most of them low quality, so she was good on that front. Leaving the moral ambiguity aside, she focused on her homework, then studying up on sign language just in case Iron Man sought her out again. That Friday she raced from her school to the subway, then hurried into through the side door of the tower, flashing her badge to get through security and then looping the lanyard over her head. They'd been given the badges when they'd first gotten the internship and given strict instructions to keep up with them. If they lost them, there was a number that they had to call immediately. The night before had been a rough patrol. At one point she'd taken a crowbar to the head when she'd interrupted a drug deal, and she was sure her right wrist wasn't broken, but the blue and purple bruising didn't look good. Plus she could barely bend it. The gloves covered it though, so hopefully they could stay on. She'd worked with them before. Plus the long sleeves, it would be fine. "Penny, you going down?" Penny hesitated when she saw Raj holding the elevator door, then shook her head. "Actually, Mr. Stark wanted to see me," she told him, a little sheepish. He snorted, rolling his eyes a little. "Yeah, of course he did." Before she could decipher that, the elevator doors were closing. Sighing, she hit the up button for the elevator, then scanned her badge and took the elevator up to the 79th floor. Mr. Stark's personal lab. Her internship badge got his person lab. The elevator opened onto a small glass-walled room, and through the glass, she could see the lab. A big lab. Like. Huge. Maybe taking up the whole floor. She took a hesitant step toward the door, then paused. She didn't see Mr. Stark. So, should she knock or? "Good evening, Penny." The voice nearly made her jump out of her skin. She looked around, eyes wide, but didn't see anyone. "I am Friday, Mr. Stark's personal assistant." "Right," she muttered. An AI. She'd known about Friday. Mr. Stark had told her about it. But she'd never heard it speak. "Hi. Nice to meet you." "It's nice to meet you as well, Penny. Mr. Stark asks that you come on in." "Right," she muttered, surprised to find that the doorknob worked. Stepping into the lab, she looked around, hesitant and terrified that Mr. Stark was going to pop out of the wall and demand to know what she thought she was doing there. Or demand to know why she was running around the city dressed in a hoodie and sweatshirt and pretending to be deaf. Instead, he popped up from behind a workbench, eyebrows lifted. "Oh, hey, kid. What time is it?" 3. Was I not supposed to come?" He waved a hand. "Nope. You're good. I'm running late," he told her with a brief smile as he waved a hand, and the holographic screens surrounding him scattered then disappeared. Spinning in his chair, he jumped to his feet. "You can put your stuff down over there if you want." She was careful when she slipped her backpack off, dropping it on the ground under a hook in the wall, removing her scarf but leaving the gloves. "Go ahead and take the gloves off too. I wanted to show you something." She hesitated. "Fry, turn up the heat in here, would you?" "Yes, sir," and, since she didn't really have an excuse not to, she pulled the gloves off, stuffing them in her backpack, then pulling her coat off and hanging it on the hook. Her sweatshirt still covered her wrists, but she was worried about the ugly bruise that peeked out from underneath her sleeve. She pulled her sleeves down as she made her way over to where Mr. Stark stood. "Take a look." He pulled something out of his pocket and held it up. She prayed that her surprise looked genuine. "Is that?" He tossed the little vial toward her and she caught it easily with her left hand. "Got it straight from Spider-Girl herself," he told her, looking proud. "How did you find her?" she asked, genuinely curious as she examined her own web fluid in one of her cartridges. She hadn't really been thinking so much about what she was doing when she'd handed it to Mr. Stark. Yes, she had. She had wanted him to look at her formula. She had wanted him to be impressed. Had wanted to prove to herself that what she was doing was impressive. Wanted a little recognition from a real-life superhero genius. "I flew around the city in my Iron Man suit until I spotted her." Friday analyzed video footage of her appearances and managed to get a pattern. He held out a hand and she gave it back, unable to miss the way his eyes followed her hands. "Did you know she was deaf?" She allowed her eyebrows to lift, a disbelieving smile turning the corners of her mouth. "Seriously?" "Yeah." He nodded, reaching into a drawer to pull out a notebook and a pencil. "I need to learn sign language." Mr. Stark muttered, pushing the notebook over toward her. "All right." Penny Parker. Youngest intern in the history of the Stark Industries internship program. She smiled a little. "Show me what you've got." "But, you have the web fluid," she told him, pointing to the little vial in his hand. "Yes, so, don't you already know the formula?" He chuckled. "Your faith in me is flattering, kid," he told her with a smirk, "but I want to see what you can do." "Oh, okay," she murmured, picking up the pencil and flinching. School had been awful, and she'd given up on taking notes, deciding to just copy Ned's notes later. None of her teachers had really noticed, thankfully, and she was pretty good at remembering things without having to write everything down. One of the men had hit her with the crowbar, and while she'd been down, another had stomped on her wrist. She'd gotten them in the end, but she'd need to repair her web shooter. Gritting her teeth, she adjusted the pencil in her grip and started to write, her hand shaking as she forced it to make the characters. "Penny?" he asked, seeming confused. She looked up at him, her wrist thanking her for the pause. His eyes were on her pencil. On her shaking hand. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm fine," she assured him. He didn't look even remotely convinced, staring down at her hand for a second. It's nothing. Just a bruise." She tried to wave him off. No luck. Can I see? It wasn't an order, but coming from Tony Stark, it may as well have been one. Sighing, she dropped the pencil and carefully peeled back her sleeve to reveal her blue and purple wrist. He hissed under his breath, his expression soft and sympathetic. Whoa. Damn, kid. He murmured, moving closer to get a better look. What happened? Mind racing, she tried to think of a good story and went with the first thing that popped into her mind. I fell. She told him simply, fully aware that she sounded like a cliché. On the subway platform. Some guy pushed past me and I tripped. She told him with a self-conscious smile and shrug. His hand carefully encircled her wrist. Eyebrows furrowed in concern when even that made her flinch. Here, Mr. Stark murmured, gesturing for her to put her arm on the table. She did. Fry? Immediately. Blue light came from the ceiling, running over her arm. It appears as if Penny suffered a mild sprain, but it is healing. He nodded, glancing up at her, and Penny was glad that the AI hadn't mentioned how quickly it was healing. I'll be right back, he told her, then hurried over to a cabinet where he pulled out a small white box. Bringing it back over, he opened it and retrieved a white bandage. She started to pull her arm back, shaking her head. Mr. Stark, it's fine, she started. He lifted an eyebrow. You really don't have to. I'm just going to bandage it, he told her, voice soft. As if she might be afraid. Well, she was, but not of him. Giving in, Penny handed her arm over once more, and he began to expertly wrap her wrist. When did you fall? He asked, turning his eyes back down to her arm. It was strange that he would know how to do this. Then again, he was an Avenger. He'd probably had some experience in first aid. A couple of days ago, she lied easily. When she got home, she'd tell May the same thing. Penny was sometimes worried about how good she was getting at lying. All right, he muttered, closing the first aid box and securing the bandage. Keep it still for a couple of days, okay? And if it gets worse, go to a doctor. A real doctor, not me. She nodded, cheeks hot. I'm sorry, Mr. Stark. He'd invited her up to his private lab and given her a chance to prove herself. And all she'd proven was that she was useless. I can go. I mean, tell someone else to come up. Raj would probably be able to tell you the formula if he had access to it anyway. The man put the first aid kit back in the cabinet and then moved back to the table, picking up the pencil himself. Zip it, kid. I wouldn't have invited you up here if I didn't think you could do this. Now, give me the formula you came up with, then we'll see if ours match. She just stared at him for a moment, and he blinked up at her before gesturing for her to hurry up. Come on, kid. Before I grow old. Oh, right, I'm sorry, she muttered, then began to rattle off the formula, his hand flying across the paper to transcribe it. He smiled when she was done, nodding his head. Then, without a word, he ripped the page out, placing it on the table, then pulled another piece of paper out of his pocket and dropped it on the table beside it. The same formula. It's the same, she murmured, eyes huge. Yeah. Good job, kid. That's pretty impressive. No, I mean, Mr. Stark, you a couple of days to do this? He lifted an eyebrow. It's just, wow, he chuckled. Kid, you did the same thing. It just took you a little longer. You're good at this. She stared at him, wide-eyed. Believe it or not, I keep tabs on everything you guys do down in that intern lab. Your work is the most impressive by far. The robot, the web formula, not to mention the other work you've done. He crossed his arms. Which is why I have a proposal for you. Well, a project. Oh, okay, she nodded. Yes, sir. I mean, yes. He seemed to be fighting a grin. You don't even know what the project is. She shrugged. It didn't matter. She'd do whatever he asked. Here. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. This project is going to require some discretion, he said seriously, voice dropping. As in, being sworn to secrecy-level discretion. She nodded. Of course. No one can know about this. Not the other interns, not your friends at school. No one. She nodded again. All right. He placed the folder on the table and slid it over. Penny opened it, feeling her mouth drop open as she stared at the paper on top. It was a suit. A suit, covered in spiderwebs. Well? He asked, a smile in his voice. You're going to make her a suit? He nodded. That's the plan. But, why? Mr. Stark lifted an eyebrow once more and she hurried to backtrack. I mean, of course, you can do anything you want and you can make. I mean, it's really cool, if you're going to make her a suit. I mean, he waited, both eyebrows raised now, and she felt her face turn red. I mean, since you don't know her and it'll probably cost a lot of money but, finally, she let herself trail off, staring down at the plans and wishing the floor would open and swallow her whole. I'm sorry, she whispered, pulling her hands away from the folder and putting them behind her back. You done? He asked, but not cruelly, with a smile, almost understanding. I'm sorry, she repeated. Her suit's pretty low-tech. Mr. Stark moved past her apology as if it hadn't been said. As if none of her embarrassing ramblings had happened. She was ridiculously grateful. I thought she might like an upgrade. She could certainly use one. And I thought I'd get my best intern to help. He didn't say it like it meant anything. It was quiet and simple and calm. But she felt her whole body glow with the words. His best intern. Tony Stark had called her his best intern like it was no big deal. You don't need my help. The words escaped before she could think about them, but even though she hated herself for saying them, they were right. Tony Stark did not need her, but he didn't seem mad that she'd said it out loud. I thought I could use an outsider's perspective. Think of it as your next intern challenge. Read through that, then draw up a plan. He didn't need her help, but he was helping her, letting her be a part of a real project, giving her invaluable experience. And, even though he didn't know it, he was giving her a chance to design her own superhero suit with almost unlimited resources. In Tony Stark's lab. Okay. She nodded, eager, and he slid the notebook across the table, along with the pencil. All right, kid. Get to work. Be careful of your wrist. Use the tablet to draw if you want. Mr. Stark moved over to his own workstation and sat down, summoning his screens. She dropped into the chair in front of the table he directed her to, opening the folder and skimming the first page once more before turning to the second page of potential designs. And a third page. Designs for web shooters. Ideas for materials. It was all amazing. She grabbed the notebook and got to work, remembering her own notebook at home. It was secret, hidden away in a desk drawer, but it was full of designs. Better web shooters. Better suit design. Better materials, if she only had the resources. And now Tony Stark was giving her the resources. Of course, he didn't know that he was giving her the resources, but still, she worked until her wrist ached, but still, she worked. She didn't care that her wrist was sprained, or that, eventually, every movement hurt. She worked for the full 3 hours until, suddenly, Mr. Stark was back at her side. Hey, kid. Ready to pack it up? Oh, yeah. She dropped the pencil, very aware of his eyes straying down to her hand. How's the wrist? She shrugged. Fine. She closed the notebook, putting it back on top of the folder, and he waved a hand. You can leave that stuff. This is going to be your desk. I'll have someone move the other stuff you were working on up here. Oh, I can, don't worry about it, he assured her. You ready to head home? Yeah, definitely. She jumped up, hurrying over to grab her scarf and coat, along with her gloves, and used her left hand to throw her backpack over her shoulder, then paused when she realized that Mr. Stark was waiting for her by the door. Sorry. What for? He asked, brow furrowed. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. You aren't, Penny. His face went kind of soft again. Hey, she approached, looking up at him. I invited you up here, kid. You earned this. I asked for your help on this project. He reached a hesitant hand out, then clapped her on the shoulder. I just wanted to make sure you got home on time. She nodded, taking a deep breath and smiling a little. He meant it. He actually wanted her to help him with this suit, because she was a good intern. Mr. Stark walked her to the elevator, then joined her, leaning against the wall. Lobby, Fry, he ordered. Can anyone talk to Friday? She wondered, screwing up the courage to ask the question out loud. He nodded. Yeah. But she only answers to me and anyone else that I authorize. Mostly the Avengers. Pepper. 1 or 2 of the people that work for Stark Industries. He glanced down at her, eyes on her wrist once more. It would be healed by the time she saw him again. But she might have another injury by then, hazards of the profession. If you need anything while you're here, she'll answer to you too," he told her suddenly, and she blinked up at him in surprise. "I mean, it's pretty low-level clearance, but if you need me, or get lost on the wrong floor again, just call for her and she can help." Before she could thank him or ask a question, the elevator opened and the two stepped into the lobby where a man she had never seen was waiting. The man didn't look particularly happy as Mr. Stark approached, gesturing for Penny to follow. She did, confused as he put an arm around the man's shoulders. The man rolled his eyes but didn't shrug Mr. Stark off. "Penny Parker, Happy Hogan," he introduced. "Happy, this is my intern, Penny." The man grunted. "Penny, meet your new chauffeur." Penny felt the blood drain from her face. "Happy's going to drive you home from the internship every week." "WH. What, Happy Hogan? He'll drive you home from your internship every week?" He clapped his hands. "All right, kid, see you next week." And then she was left with Mr. Hogan, who sighed, jerking his head for her to follow him out the door. "Come on, kid. I've got things to do, designing a suit." By the time Mr. Hogan and Penny arrived at her apartment, she was surprised to note that he didn't really look all that upset anymore. More neutral. When she'd first climbed into the back seat of the car, it had been almost oppressively silent. By the time they reached her building, he'd turned the radio on in the background, soft enough that, if she hadn't had enhanced hearing, she might not have been able to hear the words. It was weird to be driven by someone though. Like she was some kind of rich person. Like Mr. Stark. Mr. Hogan glanced over at the building, then back at her in the rearview mirror, probably noting the guys sprawled on the front steps. They were fine. She knew at least one of them, but she guessed they looked kind of rough if you didn't know them. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Hogan," she told him, climbing out of the car and grabbing her bag. "You really don't have to drive me. I can take the subway. I'll be at your school on Friday, 2:15 sharp. Be ready." That took her back a little. She had thought that Mr. Hogan was just going to drive her home from her internship. "Sir, I'll really be ready, kid," and then he was speeding off. Penny sighed, dropping her chin to her chest, then hurried into the apartment. "Hey, Penny," one of the guys greeted, blowing smoke from his nose and lifting his cigarette in greeting. "Hey, Randy, Julio, Tommy," she grinned, waving as she hurried up the stairs and into the building, then up the several flights of stairs to their apartment. Tommy was the man with the deaf son. She'd need to try and talk with him more. For practice. She flinched at that thought, wondering if that thought made her an even worse person. May was surprised when she opened their door, looking up from where she'd been cooking. "Pen, you're early. Is everything okay?" she asked, putting her spoon down. Yeah, I'm fine," she assured her aunt, standing on her tiptoes to kiss her on the cheek. "Mr. Stark had his driver give me a ride home." May lifted an eyebrow. "He did? Yeah. I think he was worried because it took me so long to take the subway home. All the other interns have cars, so he had his driver drive me home, and he's going to pick me up after school on Fridays." "Wow. You have your own chauffeur now," May teased, putting on a silly French accent. She snorted, brushing May's hand away when it shot out to ruffle her hair. "I do not. He works for Mr. Stark. He's just giving me a ride." For a moment, she wanted to tell May what else had happened. About how she had been invited by Mr. Stark to work on secret things with him in the lab. But at the last minute, she didn't. May wouldn't like to know that Penny was keeping secrets, and might take it the wrong way. And she'd promised not to say anything to anyone. So she kept her mouth shut, washing up, eating dinner, then heading to her room to do homework. For a moment, she thought about patrolling, but it was late and she didn't want to risk upsetting May if she happened to check on her, so instead, Penny lay down and pulled out her homework and her phone, texting with Ned late into the night before she finally fell asleep. The next day she spent with May, the two of them heading to the closest bookstore, then walking around the shops and restaurants like they always did, rarely buying anything but having fun together nonetheless. Penny hated that she couldn't talk to May about Spider-Girl. Hated that she had to keep such a huge part of herself a secret. But she did. There was no other choice. Not only could it put May in danger, but she was also almost certain that her aunt wouldn't let her keep patrolling. Okay, completely certain. "So, how are things at school? How's Liz?" May asked, drawing out the girl's name and grinning at Penny over her coffee. Penny was drinking a hot chocolate and was bundled up in a scarf and gloves as they sat by the window of a coffee shop. Cheeks flushing at the suggestive tone, Penny glared. "May, she barely even knows I exist," Penny whined a little, taking a sip of her hot chocolate. "We've talked, like, 5 times outside of academic decathlon." It was true. Liz had barely spoken to her outside of their practices. It was understandable. The girl was a senior and Penny was a sophomore. Why would a senior girl give someone like Penny the time of day? Then again, she had a Stark internship now. Maybe that counted for something? She doubted it, but, well, it wasn't like she could talk to the other girl about it anyway. Her internship was top secret. Mr. Stark hadn't made her sign anything, but he had asked that she not tell anyone the details. About Spider-Girl. About herself. The thought almost made her laugh. "Okay, so how's the internship?" May asked, taking a sip of her coffee and smiling at her niece's discomfort. Penny wondered, not for the first time, if her aunt could somehow read her mind. It's good. Really good. It must be if you have your own driver," Penny grinned. "He isn't my driver," she muttered, flushing. "Well, it was very nice of Mr. Stark to have someone drive you home. I worried about you taking the subway so late." "I know, May." And she did. She hated that May worried so much about her, but I was fine. "Do all of his interns get their own driver?" "Oh, I don't think so. But they're all older, so they have cars." May hummed, nodded, but still looking suspicious. Of all the things for her to get suspicious about, this was the most ridiculous. Still, it was better than her starting to suspect that her niece was pretending to be a deaf superhero. Penny kept an eye out for Mr. Stark all week when she was on her patrols, but thankfully, he was nowhere to be found. Still, she spoke to Tommy's deaf son every time she saw him. Walking along the 3rd floor of their building in the hopes of running into him and succeeding a few times. She watched YouTube videos on ASL and practiced like she had an exam coming up, making sure not to get caught by May, who would have some questions about her sudden renewal of interest in learning sign language. Patrols were mostly tame. She stopped a couple of muggers, a car thief, 2 bicycle thieves, and gave lots of old ladies directions. While she wasn't patrolling, she texted with Ned or MJ, sitting in various high spots around the city. Something about the bite had made her love being as high as she could get. Or maybe she had always loved heights. Maybe her powers just made it possible for her to act on it. Still, now that Mr. Stark had found her once on patrols, she was always on the lookout. She was also careful not to speak to anyone as Spider-Girl, which was difficult. Not impossible, though. It didn't seem like anyone was paying all that much attention to her. That wasn't a bad thing, really. She hadn't thought that she'd ever be the same kind of superhero as Mr. Stark. She was the friendly neighborhood superhero. She helped the little guy. But now Mr. Stark was making her a new suit. A real, superhero suit. When Friday came, Mr. Hogan was, as promised, waiting for her outside her school. She hurried down the stairs, practically jumping into the back seat. "Hi, Mr. Hogan. Thank you again for picking me up." The man gave a quiet, annoyed-sounding grunt, and so Penny pulled out her phone, shooting off a text to Ned that had several exclamation points. Once more, he turned the music on, soft in the background, and that helped a little. Still, despite how grateful she was to him for driving her, especially when she arrived at the tower with 20 minutes to spare for her internship, she felt bad that the man had to drive her. But he worked for Mr. Stark, and Mr. Stark had asked him to drive her. After thanking Happy, Penny scanned her badge as always, slipping into the building and hurrying to the elevator, where she was surprised to run into Jessica. "Hey, Penny, I heard that you made it to Mr. Stark's lab." The girl smiled at her as she leaned against the wall, obviously waiting for the elevator. Penny smiled a little, nodding. "Yeah, it's really cool. JT. Raj is pissed, but your work is better than his anyway." Penny fought a blush, dropping her eyes. "I don't know, I do." Jessica crossed her arms, looking at her straight on. "You're smarter than him, and he hates it." "I'm not," Penny started, making an attempt at modesty. "Tony Stark made you his private intern." "You? Not any of us. I think he would be the best judge." The elevator dinged then, and Jessica put a hand over the elevator door to keep it from closing. "You going up?" Penny nodded, and the girl stepped into the elevator, giving Penny one last smile before descending to the intern lab. Penny waited for the next elevator, hands tapping nervously at her leg. Mr. Stark had picked her. He'd picked her out of all the interns. He thought she was smart. He didn't know that she was lying to him. She shook that thought off as Friday took her to the lab, stepping into that same foyer, and hesitating before stepping up to the door. She took a deep breath, then started to tap her knuckles against the door, but it swung open before she could. "Hey, kid. You don't have to knock. You can just come in." Mr. Stark was wearing a black Metallica t-shirt and jeans. "Oh, thanks." He looked at her as she stepped into the lab, his eyes going from the scarf she had wrapped around her neck to the gloves she wore, this time not because she was hiding any bruises but because she was cold. The glance only lasted for a moment, and then he was gesturing toward the place where she'd left her stuff last week. She carried her backpack over to the hook on the wall, dropping it on the floor, then taking off her scarf. Then the gloves. The jacket. And then cardigan, leaving her in just a sweater. "That all?" he asked, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. She felt her cheeks redden a little as she dropped her eyes. "I get cold," she told him with a shrug, and he chuckled a little. "Turn up the temperature, Fry, pump it up to 71. That sound okay?" he asked. She nodded, surprised. "From now on, keep it at 71 when she's in the lab. Penny Parker protocol." "You don't have to do that," he waved her off. "I don't mind." Grabbing his tablet and placing it on the desk he designated as her workstation, he motioned for her to join him. "What do you think?" Penny sat down in her chair, leaning over and taking a look at the screen. "I drew up a couple of designs. Just the basics." He let her scroll through them, turning the 3D designs around to get a better look. "Now, show me what you've got." Hesitantly, she opened the notebook she'd grabbed from her backpack, making sure to go to the paperclip page. Mr. Stark didn't need to see doodles for the computers she was building, or the beginnings of her attempts to try and create her own AI. Ever since she's learned about Friday, she'd been trying it on her own. Swallowing hard and wishing that her hands weren't starting to sweat, Penny pushed the notebook over, standing back with her teeth digging into her lip. She wished she could be cool and calm like him, his hands behind his back as he bent over her work, giving it his full attention like it was something that was actually important. Fighting the urge to stare at his face while he read through her notes, she risked quick glances instead. He seemed engrossed, and she could almost watch the cogs turning in his mind. Was he thinking of ways to make her designs better? Or just dismissing them? Maybe they weren't good enough. And, Penny told herself very firmly, that would be fine. He was one of the smartest men in the world. There was no way she should be so hopeful. She was 14 years old. Why would he be impressed by her work? The man reached out a hand to the notebook, seeming to look a little more closely as he picked it up, then started to remove the paperclip. She froze, jaw tightening, heart stopping. There was nothing incriminating about her notebook. Just web formulas, which he already knew about, and suit plans, along with plans for computers and tech she'd never be able to afford to build. And the plans for an AI that were probably so basic that he'd laugh. But she didn't want Mr. Stark to laugh at her. The man paused, fingers on the paperclip, then turned to her, seeming to take in her expression. "May I?" he asked. And how was she supposed to say no? Yeah, sure. Yeah." He hesitated, then removed the paperclip, holding it as he flipped through the previous pages. Penny wrapped her arms around herself, dropping her eyes and waiting stiffly. He looked through the pages for a while, then, carefully replacing the paperclip, he sat the notebook down exactly as he'd found it and crossed his arms, regarding her with the same intensity as he'd given the notebook. "All right," he finally said, pulling up a rolling chair and gesturing for her to scoot up next to him. She did, doing the very best she could not to freak out at how cool this was. She wanted to call Ned. Maybe record this moment. But instead, she focused on the new document he pulled up on his tablet. "Go ahead and transfer your designs onto here. Talk me through your thought process." And, taking a deep breath and picking up the stylus he rolled over to her, she did. They worked for almost 2 hours straight. Every few minutes Mr. Stark asked a question or gave input, pointing to something she'd drawn and either made a suggestion or, once or twice, praised her. Actually praised her. Told her that she'd had a good idea. That she'd done a good job. Tony Stark said the words, "That was a really good idea. I think we can make that work," to her, Penny Parker. And she hadn't been able to get it on camera. They weren't quite done after the 2 hours, and Penny would have been fine to keep working. Heck, she'd have kept working all day and night, had her stomach not growled right in the middle of one of his questions. At first, she hadn't thought he'd heard, because she didn't pause and he didn't say anything. But as soon as she finished talking, he tapped the table and stood up, stretching a little and groaning as he put a hand on his back. Penny had to admit, she was confused. They still had another hour or so. But then he jerked his head, gesturing for her to follow him. "Come on, kid." She did, jumping up, then closing her eyes for a second when a wave of dizziness hit her, making the edges of her vision go a bit gray. "Penny?" he asked, voice a lot softer. "You good, kid?" "Huh? Yeah, I'm fine." She forced herself to smile and hurried to join him where he'd paused in the middle of the lab. "Where are we going?" He paused, then started walking again, her trotting at his heels until he reached a refrigerator. He pulled it open. "Water or soda? Or, green-flavored sports drink." Surely enough, in the refrigerator were rows of unopened beverages. "What?" she asked. He lifted an eyebrow and she quickly realized what he was saying. "Oh, water?" He grabbed one of the bottles, passing it to her. "Turkey or ham?" he asked then. Penny shook her head. I don't." "Oh, are you a vegetarian?" he wondered, seeming concerned. "No," she told him slowly. "I'm making sandwiches. Would you rather have turkey or ham? Or chicken? I think we have chicken in here too." "You, Mr. Stark, you don't have to, turkey, ham, or chicken," he repeated slowly. Turkey." The man nodded, washing his hands, then putting two sandwiches together as she stood off to the side, shifting from foot to foot nervously. Should she offer to help, she wondered, but by the time she got up the courage, the man had already put the two sandwiches on cheap paper plates. "We've got chips, popcorn." He stuck his head in a cabinet that had a white piece of copy paper with the words, "Food Not Science," written in what looked to be 14-point Times New Roman taped to it. She tried to imagine Tony Stark opening up Microsoft Word and doing any of that, but her brain couldn't quite conjure the image. "More chips." "Wow, I have a lot of chips." Protein bars. Basically sugar, but we don't tell Pepper that." And, hater again, and pulled out a bag. Prepackaged baby carrots and ranch. Penny just stared at him for a long moment as he held up the bag full of tiny packages of carrots almost triumphantly, not sure what was happening. Her brain tried to go back to the beginning. Tried to figure out how any of this had happened. Penny stammered, eyes shooting around the room, then finally landing on him again. "Mr. Stark, you don't have to." "Do you like carrots?" he wondered, speaking as if he hadn't heard her. "Yeah. Yeah." He plucked a container of them out of his bag, placing it on her plate, then pulled out two individual-sized bags of Doritos. Mr. Stark held out a plate to her and she took it, then carried that and the bottle of water over to the card table that was set up in the corner, sitting in a metal folding chair. "Pep makes me keep food down here, otherwise I'll forget to eat." "Oh," she murmured, taking a bite of her sandwich and feeling awkward. But before she could try to think of a conversation starter for a conversation with Tony Stark, he began to talk as if every Friday found them eating lunch in his lab. "So I have some prototypes for the material for her suit. A few steps above spandex, but in order to make it bulletproof I'd have to sacrifice some mobility. Unless I make some really quick advancements in nanotechnology. That's what they have in Wakanda, right? Yeah. I've been trying to get Princess Shuri to share her secrets." He grinned as he took a bite. "So what do you think? Focus on flexibility or make it bulletproof?" Penny thought seriously for a moment. "Flexibility," she told him decisively. He nodded, humming to himself. He pointed a finger at her. "Agreed." Lessons. Penny was somewhat glad that the temperature was dropping, making it plausible for her to wear even more clothing than usual. Tank top. Long-sleeved shirt. Sweater. Cardigan. Winter coat. Scarf. Gloves. That ought to do it, she had thought that morning, wincing at almost every movement. Last night's patrols had been bad. Okay, so all week had been bad. She'd been keeping an eye out for Mr. Stark, hoping not to run into him again before she'd become better at sign language, which she'd been practicing like crazy. Still, she had no doubt that Mr. Stark was close to fluent by now if he'd been practicing. She'd also been making sure not to banter with the criminals she'd been stopping for fear that someone would record her and put it online. And then Mr. Stark would see, and this whole intern, Spider-Girl thing would fall apart. So she fought silently, and she wasn't sure what it was about that week, but there was more gang violence than she was used to, which meant more bruises and a couple of very close shots when one of the gangs had more guns than she'd known about. She managed not to get shot. Okay, so she kind of got shot once, grazed. But thankfully that was on Tuesday, and by Friday she only had bruising and maybe some broken ribs to worry about. Her side was pretty colorful, but as long as she didn't move too much, it was fine. Sitting in the back of Happy's car, she shivered a little, staring out the window and trying to think of something to say. The man was just as quiet as he'd been the first day, and he seemed to radiate an air of irritation. Of course, he worked for Mr. Stark, and she had a feeling that his official job title wasn't intern chauffeur. He'd been waiting for her outside the school just like last week, and after waving to Ned and avoiding the foot Flash stuck out to trip her, flipping him off behind her back, she'd hurried to climb into the car, not wanting to make him wait. The man sighed in the front seat, glancing back at her in the rearview mirror. "What do you want to eat, kid?" Penny frowned, pulled from her thoughts. She'd just been wondering if it would be rude to pull out some homework, and hadn't yet decided. Sorry?" she asked. "Boss said I had to feed you beforehand, so what do you want?" "Mr. Hogan, you don't have to, actually I do. So what do you want?" Anything is fine." She mumbled, somewhat miserable and more than a little embarrassed. Staring determinedly down at her lap, she flinched when he sighed, sounding even more put out than before. "I'm sorry. I really don't care. We can get whatever's closest." He was quiet in the front for a moment, and then he sighed. "How about sandwiches?" he offered, his voice a little softer. "Okay." He pulled into the parking lot of a sandwich place, hopping out of the car and, not sure if she was supposed to follow, she slowly opened her door, realizing after a second that he was waiting for her, arms crossed, one eyebrow lifted. Grabbing her purse and throwing it over her shoulder, she followed, tucking her scarf more tightly around her neck and shivering as the wind blew. She tried to walk upright, not wanting to slouch over and risk shifting the ribs that were already killing her. He didn't seem to notice, leading her into the sandwich shop where she ordered a sandwich and a bag of chips, but was waved away when she started to pull out her wallet. Mr. Hogan grabbed a bottle of water too, gesturing for the girl behind the counter. "Oh, Mr. Hogan, you don't have to, Tony's orders, kid. Consider it an internship perk." He handed over a credit card that was so black and shiny that she didn't even see a name on it. The cashier swiped it, lifting a slight eyebrow, then went ahead and pushed a button, handing over his receipt. Without a word, Mr. Hogan led her back out to the AR. "Go ahead and eat on the way," he ordered, starting the car. She nodded, carefully unwrapping the sandwich and putting the chips on the seat beside her, vowing not to get a crumb in this fancy car. They were backing out when the impact came, her senses going off just a half-second before the car plowed into them. She couldn't help but scream. The pain that came as the door on her side caved in, slamming into her already broken ribs. Wrapping an arm around her side, she gasped as Mr. Hogan swore, slamming on the brakes and pulling forward back into the parking spot before turning the car off. The other car hadn't been going that fast, they'd just been pulling into the parking lot from the street, but it had hit her hard enough that she had to breathe through her teeth, refusing to make any noise. Mr. Hogan jumped out of the car, and she expected him to start yelling at the other driver or to call the insurance company. Instead, he raced over to her side of the car, yanking the door open and putting a careful hand on her back. He was talking then, but not to her. "Yeah, Tony. Some moron hit us on the passenger side." "Yeah." Penny frowned at that, then realized what he must have pulled out his phone. He'd called Mr. Stark. "Are you okay, Penny?" Mr. Hogan asked, that gentle hand still on her back. "Here, let me see, kid." His hand started to move to her side but she stiffened. "No," she gasped out, jerking away from him, and immediately his hands went up. He must have hung up the phone because it wasn't in his hands anymore. "I'm fine, don't." "Easy, kiddo. I'm not going to hurt you. Just want to see the damage." He spoke slowly as if she were a child. "I'm fine," she insisted, getting her breath back. There was something in his eyes then, his lips pursed together. If you don't let me look, I've got to take you to the hospital. If you let me take a look and it's nothing, Tony said I could just bring you to the medbay. He was as serious as before but gentler. Nicer. It was a tone she hadn't suspected from him. I just need to look and see if you're okay. I was Tony's bodyguard for a long time, Penny. Got all kinds of first aid training. I'm not going to hurt you, promise. She sighed, not seeing any way out of it. His hand on her shoulder guided her as she sat back against the seat, and carefully, she shifted the many layers of clothing so that she could pull the side of them up, revealing what she knew were a rainbow of bruises. He hissed under his breath beside her, shaking his head and looking more concerned before. Shit, is she okay? Another voice asked, and Mr. Hogan whirled on his heels, his body blocking her. Just leave your insurance information. Here, he handed the man a card that she assumed had all of his information on it. I'm so sorry, I didn't see you. Penny pulled her clothes back down, hoping he hadn't seen the bruises that extended around to her back and stomach. Wrapping her scarf more tightly around her neck, she stared down at her untouched food as Mr. Hogan got rid of the other guy who'd left his information scrawled on a napkin. You alright, kid? I'm fine, Mr. Hogan. Just call me Happy. Everyone else does. He dismissed. Why don't you move up to the front? It's fine to drive. She nodded, and without a word, he took her food and the bottle of water, then held out a hand. Penny hesitated before taking it, grimacing but trying to keep her expression neutral. He propped a hand under her elbow, looking grim as he steadied her. I think you might need a hospital, kid. She shook her head. It's fine. Just a bruise. Penny lowered herself into the passenger's side, taking the food back when he handed it to her. If you've got broken ribs, there's not really anything a doctor can do for broken ribs, she interrupted, knowing that it was kind of rude to interrupt him like that but growing desperate. She couldn't let them find out. No one. The man climbed into the driver's seat, then hesitated, hands resting on the wheel. Penny. Please. Mr. Hogan. Happy. I'm fine. Just let me go to the internship, please. She all but begged. He was quiet for a long time, then nodded, apparently giving in. All right, kid. Go ahead and eat that. She did, eating her sandwich and herself. It wasn't quite enough, but it was something. Mr. Stark and Miss Potts were waiting for them when they arrived at the tower, both of them in the lobby when she entered with Happy. Mr. Stark gave her a once-over, but it was Miss Potts who stepped forward. We have a doctor waiting in the medbay to look you over. Penny shook her head. No way she could let a doctor see. They'd know that those bruises didn't just come from a minor fender bender. I'm fine, really, Miss Potts, she told the woman, taking an unconscious step back. Her eyes darted over to Mr. Stark, who watched the exchange with a strange expression. Please. I'm fine. Miss Potts looked upset, but Mr. Stark chose that moment to step in, pointing a finger at her. If you pass out in my lab, you're on dish duty for 2 weeks. He warned, no real threat in his voice. Tony, she's fine, Pep. See, walking and talking and everything. Let's get back to work. Gratefully, Penny followed him to the elevator, subtly leaning against the wall as they started their ascent. She knew he was glancing at her, but she kept her eyes forward, her backpack slung over her left shoulder which had fared better. When they reached the lab, he gestured for her to head over to her usual place to drop off her stuff, and she did, pulling off several layers until she was left in just the sweater and undershirts. The heat was obviously on, which was nice, especially when she had to pull her gloves off as usual. Let's get back to web shooter combinations, he suggested, and the two of them sat at her desk, both drawing up ideas on their respective tablets. They worked together for a couple of hours, taking a break halfway through to grab water and stretch. He introduced her a little more properly to his robots, and her favorite was Dummy, who patted her on the head with his claw, making her laugh. The suit, really coming along, he told her as she was getting a closer look at Dummy's claw. I think we might have enough web shooter combinations, she told him, trying not to sound bemused, but he snorted anyway. Maybe you're right. All right. Brainstorm time. What else can we put in the suit? What would you want in a superhero suit? For a second, she was sure her heart stopped, but when she turned to glance at him, he was tapping his pen against a table, seeming deep in thought. Me? She asked, voice coming out a little squeaky. Yeah, he told her carelessly, waving a hand. Pretend we're making this for you. What would you want in a super suit? She's probably only a few years older than you. In college, probably. Really? He glanced up. I mean, I didn't get a great look at her when she swung by. She's about your size. I'd say she's on the young side. Why else would she just decide to start doing this whole spider thing now? Penny shrugged. Okay. Things you'd want in a super suit. Go. He pointed at her, waiting. Lightning round. Whatever comes to mind. There are no bad ideas. A heater. She told him, and he lifted an eyebrow, looking amused. A heater? You said no ideas were bad ideas. She told him a little defensively, and he snorted. You're right. I did say that. Fry, start a list. Yes, boss. Okay. Heater. What else? How about parachute? She shrugged and he gestured to the ceiling. Add that to the list. Fry next. An AI. The words were out before she could think about what she was saying, and as soon as she'd said it, she wanted to take it back. It was too much to ask. Programming an AI was a serious task. One that would take a long time. How was she supposed to ask him to do something like that? But he was nodding, a slow smile spreading over his face. An AI, he repeated slowly. Yeah, like Friday. She spoke hesitantly. To help her out. But, with a screen. Text-based in addition to the audio output. Why keep the audio? She can feel the vibrations. Make it more lifelike. He nodded, crossing his arms. How would she communicate with it? Tapping. Morse code. Maybe she can talk, but she doesn't like to talk around people. So if she could talk to it. Right. How do you know she knows Morse code? I don't. She shrugged. We could make it an option. And maybe add the option to sync with a phone so she can give commands that way? Sign language? Would it be possible to have he communicate with an AI through sign language? He put a hand over his mouth thoughtfully, then nodded. Maybe. Friday can recognize gestures. So, maybe. He was staring at her. Almost impressed. It was ridiculous, of course. There was no way Mr. Stark was impressed by her, some random 14-year-old intern. Anybody could have thought of that. But still, he was smiling at her. She smiled back, dropping her eyes to the ground. That's good. That's an AI. An AI for a deaf superhero. A superhero who is deaf. I'll have to ask which she prefers. He was muttering to himself, still smiling, obviously working it out in his own mind as Penny tried to come to terms with the fact that Tony Stark thought she was a superhero. Friday. Start research. Get me some ideas on how this could be possible. Yes, boss. All right. Have you ever programmed anything like an AI? She shook her head. I saw in your notebook. You started drawing up plans for one. Yeah, but I don't really know. Okay. We've got about, he checked his watch. An hour left. Let's get started. He gestured for her to follow him and he did. Sitting at her desk once more. Grab your notebook. She did, turning to a fresh page. All right. I'm going to go fast, so try to keep up and ask questions if you need to. Lesson 1. Wondering how on earth this could possibly be her life, she grabbed a pen and started writing, pen flying across the page as her personal hero gave her a private lesson on programming. Pepper's interlude. Pepper's heels clicked on the ground as she hurried down the hall without seeming to hurry, her eyes firmly forward, Stark tablet under one arm. No one stopped her, of course. Ever since she'd started working for Stark Industries and, more importantly, Tony, she'd learned that she could go pretty much anywhere she chose as long as she looked determined. Her boyfriend? Ex-boss? Friend? Tony. Tony was down in the lab, of course, where she usually found him. She tried not to let her emotions show on her face, tried not to let anyone know that she was upset. Of course, Tony would know. He'd always been able to tell when she was upset and thus had often tried to upset her, hoping to get a rise out of her. She'd done her best to deny him that pleasure as often as possible, at first with irritation, then, as the years had passed, with growing fondness. Now, however, she was properly upset. She didn't knock on the door to his lab, just went in, and he seemed to be expecting her. The man stood by one of the many desks, hands behind his back, staring up at a screen with a picture of Penelope Parker in one corner. The picture from her Stark Industries internship badge. You know that she works for SI, right? Pepper asked, fighting for patience. The man in front of her sighed, not turning around but not arguing. and that we are liable if she is injured here. You know that, right?" "She wasn't injured here," he dismissed, but his voice was soft, thoughtful, like he had a puzzle to solve. And she knew it was pretty much pointless to try and talk to him when he was like this. But she had to try. "She was injured in a car that belongs to you, driven by a man employed by you on her way to an internship at Stark Industries. Not only that, how do you think it will look if it gets out that we didn't even have her looked at by a doctor?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice level. "She's 14, Tony. We had to accept some responsibility for her." She said no. "Pep, what did you want me to do? Tie her down?" he asked, eyes never leaving the screen. He did this, sometimes. Gave whoever he was talking to 10% of his attention while the other 90% focused on work. And he knew she hated that. "Tony," she started, the word a sign. She was tired. It was the end of a long day of meetings and paperwork, and she just wanted to go up to their floor and relax on the sofa with Tony. But he was thinking, and once he got to thinking, it could be hard to get him to stop. There was something about this intern that had captured his attention. And Pepper was glad. The whole internship thing had been her idea. A way to help some local kids and also get some good press for the company. Not to mention training some prospective new talent. At first, Tony had been hesitant. Hadn't wanted high schoolers running around the building unsupervised. But Pepper has pushed and he'd given in. Agreed to give them some things to do. Projects to work on. And then that girl had come up to the Avengers meeting and he'd somehow gotten curious about her. She did good work, that much was for sure. She was bright. Very polite. Hesitant, at times, but that was to be expected from a girl as young as she was. Tony had been upset about her taking the subway home and had tasked Happy with giving her a ride. Pepper wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. Teenagers took the subway all the time in New York. She certainly had. Then again, Pepper didn't know how far away the girl lived. She was scared. Those 3 words brought Pepper's thoughts to a screeching halt as she remembered the interaction she'd had with the young girl. As soon as she'd walked in, the girl had been looking for a way out. Penny had taken a step back when Pepper had stepped forward, and her eyes had darted around the room, looking for an escape. At the time, Pepper had been too focused on her own worry. It wouldn't look great in the press if someone found out that a Stark Industries intern was injured in a car crash and not treated for any injuries. And she'd figured that Penny just hadn't wanted to put them out, to cause trouble. Why would she be scared? She asked, moving closer to Tony and staring at the picture on the screen, so close to his side that their shoulders touched. He reached out an arm, encircling her waist and pulling her close as if unconsciously. Penny Parker. 14 years old. Sophomore in high school. In all AP and advanced classes, and, considering she'd caught the attention of Tony Stark, most likely a genius. "That conference next week, the expo, where is it again?" he asked instead of giving her an answer. "DC. She told him hesitantly. He'd resisted going, insisting that he didn't want to give a speech or talk to second-rate scientists, but she'd asked him to go and so he'd said yes. It would be good press anyway. We leave Friday night and return early Monday morning, so you won't miss your internship." "Who all is going?" "You, me, Rhodey, Natasha. We wanted a couple of people to represent the Avengers." "I need an intern to come with us," she balked, jaw-dropping. "What? Why?" he smirked. "Oh, you know, to follow me around, fetch me coffee, carry my briefcase." Pepper had known Tony for what felt like half of her life. She thought she had a pretty good grasp on his personality. And although the man had always had a public persona that screamed narcissist, he'd never made interns fetch him coffee or carry his stuff. Or do anything, really. Hell, Tony had never really had interns. But he had that look on his face and she knew it would be easier to just humor him. She took a deep breath, pulling out her tablet to make a memo. "Okay. I'd say out of all the applicants, Jessica would be." "Penny." She gave him a look, but his expression told her he was dead serious. "I want to bring Penny to the conference." Pepper hesitated, but she knew that it would be pointless to argue. "Fine. I'll give her a call." Flying Spider. The call came at 8:30, after Penny and May had eaten dinner, loaf of some kind. Maybe meatloaf. Penny was in her room, finishing up some reading for class when it buzzed on her desk. She frowned at her phone. Ned never called her. Ever. Unless it was an emergency. Neither did MJ. Or anyone. All of her friends just texted. which was great. Because she hated talking to people on the phone. She had it set up so that phone calls didn't even come through unless they were from someone like May or anyone else on her contacts list. So when she picked it up, she was surprised to see Miss Potts' name and number. She'd never actually gotten a call from the woman who was her boss's etc. etc. She had no idea how she suddenly had both Tony Stark and Pepper Potts' phone numbers, but still, she picked it up, stammering a little in her greeting. Hello? Hello. Is this Penny Parker? Yes. Yes, Miss Potts? Hello, Penny. I'm sorry to bother you at home so late. No, that's fine, she stuttered. Miss Potts hesitated for a moment. How are you feeling? Oh, I'm fine. It was just a fender bender. I can barely feel lit. I'm glad to hear it. If you need a doctor, let me know and I'll take care of it. Penny hummed some kind of answer, hoping to deflect. Miss Potts seemed to understand that she didn't want to talk about that, and so she moved on. The reason I'm calling is that there is a conference next weekend and I would like for you to accompany us. We would be leaving Friday evening and returning late on Sunday. Penny blinked, staring straight ahead at the wall behind her desk for a moment. You want me to come with you? Yes. We need an intern. Mr. Stark likes to have someone to fetch his coffee and carry his briefcase. There was something strange in her voice as she said those words. Like she didn't quite believe them. It's all expenses paid, of course. You'd have your own room at the hotel and some free time to look around the conference. It's in DC, so you'd be welcome to look around the city as well. Happy will be coming as well. DC. Washington, D.C., Penny clarified as if there was another one. Yes. The woman answered, a smile in her voice. We would need to get your aunt's permission, of course. But if I could speak to her on the phone, that would suffice. Oh, right, yeah. I can get her. Just a second. Please. Jumping up and placing a hand over the mouthpiece, she raced back into the kitchen, waving a hand at May to get her attention. The woman lifted her eyebrows, crossing her arms and smiling a little. I thought you were going to do homework. Miss Potts called. She needs your permission for me to go to a conference, she stage whispered. A conference? May matched her tone, then took the phone that Penny held out. This is May Parker. A pause. Penny could mostly hear her words. It was the same spiel that she'd given Penny. May interjected with the occasional, I see, or, really. Finally, May gave her a once-over, nodding a little. Of course. She'll need to come home after school that day, and I can bring her to the tower. I'd like to speak to Mr. Stark if you wouldn't mind. Miss Potts paused, then spoke again, more softly. Of course. I understand. I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to you. I'll bring her by at 5 o'clock if that would be all right. That would be perfect, Mrs. Parker. Thank you. May ended the call and handed it to Penny, lifting an eyebrow. He wants you specifically? Penny felt her stomach drop a little at her tone. I'm the intern he's been working with the most. You're his personal intern. May crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. Do you like working with him? Yeah, he's a great teacher. He's really patient and nice, and he's teaching me how to program an AI. For a second, she worried that she'd said too much, but May didn't seem interested in asking any questions about the actual programming or why she would be programming an AI. And that's all he ever does. He teaches you. Penny felt her eyes go wide. Of course. May, he wouldn't. He's really nice and he wouldn't do that. May looked at her for a moment, then softened, nodding a little. All right. But you know that you can talk to me, right? About anything? Penny nodded, and her aunt pulled her close, kissing her forehead before resting her cheek on Penny's head. Of course I do. And you know that it's my job to protect you. Penny nodded again. I still want to meet him. Ask him about the internship. She sighed and May laughed a little. Don't worry. I won't embarrass you. I'm not just any aunt, you know. Penny groaned, throwing her head back and pushing away to go to her room. I'm a cool aunt. I shouldn't have let you watch that movie, she called, letting her door shut behind her and smiling a little when her aunt laughed. When they arrived at the compound at 4:55 on Friday afternoon, Miss Potts was waiting outside, hands clasped, a smile on her face. May pulled into one of the available spots in the front circle and they both climbed out, Penny with her backpack that had her laptop and some schoolwork, and a small duffel bag with her clothes. Miss Potts had sent her an email assuring her that the clothes she normally wore to the internship would be fine, but she'd packed black dress pants and flats along with some nicer button-up blouses. May had watched her try on every outfit and has promised that she looked very grown-up and professional. For the moment, she was wearing jeans and a nice blouse, plus one of her cardigans. She'd packed another, gloves, a scarf, and a coat. This week's weapon of choice had been a crowbar, and 2 nights ago she'd gotten hit hard enough in the back of the head that she'd seen stars, but luckily she'd webbed all the guys up. Otherwise, it was just the normal bruises. She had always bruised easily, and now that she was swinging around queens and fighting criminals, it was worse. Her arms were covered in them, mostly from the elbow up, so that was good. Her side had healed, but she had a huge, bluish-greenish mark on her knee that still hurt from where she'd landed on it 2 nights ago, after the blow to the head. But she wasn't too worried. Her clothes would cover her, and there was no reason for anyone to see her knee or her upper arms. Or the back of her neck where a huge guy trying to break into a liquor store had grabbed her. She figured that would be completely gone by the next day, since it had happened 3 days ago. May, she started, glancing around, but her aunt just smiled. "Don't worry, baby. I promise not to embarrass you in front of Iron Man." Not believing her for a second, Penny followed the woman, slinging her purse over her shoulder, and Pepper stepped forward, reaching out a hand to May, who took it. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Parker." "It's nice to meet you too, Miss Potts." The woman smiled at both of them, then led them inside to the lobby, and Mr. Stark, who had been talking to Steve Rogers, as in Captain America himself, turned to greet them. "Excuse me. Just had some Avengers business to wrap up. Mrs. Parker, so nice to meet you." "Hello, Mr. Stark." May's tone had cooled a little, and she reached a hand over to the back of Penny's neck, squeezing in what would have been a protective manner had her fingers not hit one of the bruises. Penny fought a flinch, working hard to keep her smile. Mr. Stark's eyes cut over to her for just a second, and then he held out a hand that May shook. "I'll admit, I was surprised when Miss Potts called. I didn't know that this internship would involve travel." Mr. Stark nodded. "It was sort of a last-minute thing. I thought it would be a good opportunity for Penny to see some of what is being developed in the science field." "Do you usually only take one intern to these conferences?" Penny dropped her eyes, praying that he wouldn't be offended. He didn't seem to be. "Yes, usually. We only take the top intern to events like this." "And what exactly will she be doing?" "I'll myself and Miss Potts. Sometimes they get coffee. Or snacks. And she'll get free time to explore the expo." "Supervised?" May asked, words soft and a little sharp. Penny felt herself flush, but didn't dare look up. "My bodyguard will stay with her if she leaves the building. We take every precaution to ensure that our interns are safe," he assured her, not sounding upset at all. No. His tone wasn't upset. It was something else. Maybe suspicious. But that was ridiculous. As soon as the thought occurred, she pushed it away. Besides, May didn't seem to think anything was amiss. She was just being her usual brand of protective. Beside Mr. Stark, Captain America cleared his throat a little. Penny, having almost forgotten that Captain America himself was standing there, jumped a bit. "Forgive my manners. This is Steve Rogers." May held out a hand, smiling a little softer now. "Of course. Hello, Mr. Rogers. Please, just call me Steve. It's nice to meet you." Then he turned to Penny with an equally kind smile. "Hello, Penny. It's good to see you again. How are you?" Penny had met Steve Rogers exactly once, during which she'd spilled coffee on herself. And he'd remembered her name. Still, her aunt gave her a look, one that said, "You'll be telling me about the fact that you know Captain America later." Penny gave her a tight, almost apologetic smile. "Oh, I'm fine, thank you, Mr. Rogers. How are you?" He gave her a warm smile. "It's just Steve. And I'm pretty good. Wish I were coming along. It's supposed to be a pretty interesting conference." Nat's excited. Penny furrowed her eyebrows. "Nat?" she wondered. "Natasha. Wait. The Black Widow is coming." Mr. Stark smiled down at her, softening. "She is. As a matter of fact, Happy is getting the car ready and everyone else is waiting for us." Penny shot her aunt a look that she sincerely hoped conveyed, "See, more people are going than just me. And there will be 2 women besides me. It's perfectly safe." She wasn't sure if her objective was accomplished, but her aunt nodded anyway. Of course. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Stark. Steve. Penny, call me tonight. She reached out, squeezing Penny's shoulder, and Penny was both relieved and a little sad that she didn't try and kiss her cheek or anything. Love you, May. Her aunt gave a faint smile, glancing at Mr. Stark one last time. Love you. And then Penny was following Miss Potts to the side door where, just outside, a fancy black van was waiting. Happy was standing beside it, reaching out to take her bags before she could say hello. Oh, hey Happy, I can carry. Okay, she muttered as he took her duffel bag and threw it in the back where a couple of suitcases already sat. Thanks. Hey, kid. Get in. He ordered, his small smile softening the words. She did, climbing in the back as directed. There were 3 rows of seats in addition to the front seat. Like a soccer mom van, and she edged her way to the back, careful not to hit anyone with her purse or her backpack. Tony Stark owned a soccer mom van. She wondered briefly how many cars Mr. Stark had. In the front was Happy, who was driving, then the Black Widow, and who she was about 75% sure was War Machine, or Iron Patriot. Whichever he preferred, and then Mr. Stark and Miss Potts climbed into the seat right in front of her. Surprisingly, Mr. Stark turned in his seat, an arm around the back as he moved to face her. Sorry about the short notice, kid. Oh, no, that's fine, she promised. Thank you for letting me come. His eyes turned soft. Sure thing, kid. You're the perfect person for the job. And, what exactly is the job? She asked, hesitant. You can just make sure I have coffee. He waved the question off, gesturing to her backpack. You got homework? It's about a 40-minute ride to the compound where we're getting on the plane, so you can do your homework or read or nap. Whatever you want. I have some homework. She peered past him at the Black Widow and War Machine, who hadn't turned around in their seats. He followed her gaze and leaned forward, poking at Natasha Romanoff's shoulder. She turned, lifting an eyebrow. Guys, this is my intern, Penny Parker. Penny, this is Natasha and Rhodey. Miss Romanoff. Colonel Rhodes. It's so good to meet you. The woman gave Mr. Stark a look, then turned to Penny with a smile, Colonel Rhodes turning as well. It's nice to meet you, Penny. You can call me Natasha. Everyone else calls me Rhodey, so you might as well. Colonel Rhodes offered, waving a hand and smiling as well. It's nice to officially meet you, Penny. And then everyone turned back around in their seats, minus Mr. Stark, who watched her for a second longer as she pulled her book out. When she glanced up and met his eyes, he gave a quick smile. You cold, kid? I'm okay. He nodded, eyes going to her scarf, and then he turned around in his seat. By the time they got to the compound, Penny was done with most of her work, and she hopped out of the van easily, throwing her backpack over her shoulder. The plane was obviously a private plane. Of course. Happy grabbed all the bags, loading them up, waving Penny off when she offered to help. So instead she tightened her scarf and jacket and headed up the stairs to the plane, staring around in wonder. First time on a private plane? Natasha asked from her seat towards the front, lips quirked in amusement. First time on any plane. She admitted, waiting to be told where to sit but not wanting to look like it. Across the aisle from Natasha, Colonel Rhodes sat, holding what looked like a novel. A few rows back across from what she assumed was a minibar, Mr. Stark and Miss Potts sat together. Mr. Stark was the first to glance up at her and he gestured for her to come on back. Sir, wherever you want, Pen. He gestured around the plane, so she took a seat behind his, curling up in the chair and pulling the sweater more firmly around her. Cold? He asked, standing from his seat and pulling a blanket out of a compartment over her head and tossing it to her. Thanks. The flight's only a couple of hours. He gestured to the mini-bar. There's soda and water in there if you want any. It quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to be anything like what she'd seen of planes on TV. At least, not coach. Her seat reclined almost all the way back, and there was a long footrest like a recliner. A small screen swung out of the wall and appeared to have all of the movies. Every last one of them. Curling up in the seat as the plane took off, she stared out the window, popped her earbuds in, and tried not to think about the fact that her parents had died in a plane crash. She was in a plane full of superheroes. Well, Iron Man, Black Widow, War Machine, and Pepper Potts. She was sure Happy was pretty useful in a crisis too. Once they were in the air, she pulled out her homework once more and decided to get it finished. Studious, aren't you? Penny glanced up, having heard the Black Widow approach but not thinking that she would stop to talk to her. Yeah, I'm almost done. Just have some chemistry to finish up. The woman nodded, then headed to the mini-bar, grabbed 2 sodas, and brought Penny one. Oh, thank you, Miss Romanoff. Just Natasha. The woman sat across from Penny, taking a long drink as Penny hesitantly closed her book. So, Penny Parker. Youngest of the Stark Industries interns and also, objectively, the most impressive. Penny glanced around, unsure of what she should say to that. What do you think of the internship so far? It's amazing. Yeah, I never could understand what Stark was rambling about when he goes on about science. I suppose you do. It wasn't a question, but she still felt compelled to answer. Oh, sometimes. I guess. She opened her own soda, needing something to do with her hands. I think you'll like the conference then. Lots of science and scientists showing off. Tony's giving a talk, and Rhodey is going to say something about the Avengers. She waved a hand. I'm juicy. Penny sincerely doubted that. Natasha Romanoff was there for a reason. She had to be. Do you know what I'll be doing? Natasha regraded her for a moment. He doesn't usually bring interns. Maybe you'll just get to see the exhibits and listen to the talks. Before Penny could comment on that, the plane shook a little, dipping down in the air just enough that her stomach flipped. It was one thing to swing through the city when she was in control of where she was going. It was another to be in a giant metal cylinder that trembled and rattled through what she guessed was turbulence. Natasha didn't seem worried, and Penny did her best not to seem worried either, biting down on the inside of her lip and taking deep breaths. It's okay, the woman told her softly, reaching out a hand and placing it on Penny's knee. She stared up at the assassin, dumbfounded. Just turbulence. It happens on almost every flight. Penny gave a sharp nod, pulling the blanket more firmly around her lap. I looked into you. The woman admitted then, almost sheepish, but not quite. Just the public records. You're very intelligent, of course. Excellent grades. Live with your aunt. She waved a hand as though Penny's heart wasn't pounding, and, your parents. That wasn't where Penny had thought that was going. Oh, yeah. They were geneticists who worked for S.H.I.E.L.D., right? Yeah, they did. Penny nodded, glad that they were getting off the topic of her for a moment. I didn't know until later, but they were some of the top scientists there. Penny hesitated. Did you ever meet them? No, I wasn't with S.H.I.E.L.D. yet, but I did hear a little about them. They were brilliant. It looks like you inherited some of that. Natasha's smile was nothing but kind as she stood up, the turbulence long over. I'll let you get back to your work. Moving quickly, she put a hand on Penny's upper arm, giving her 2 quick pats before moving back to her own seat. A little confused, Penny pulled her homework out once more and finished up as quickly as she could, eager to focus only on the conference. The conference part 1. Penny smiled as the plane started its descent, placing her hands on the armrests at her side. Landing was almost as much fun as taking off. Penny loved flying. Okay. She liked it best when she was in control of it. But after a couple of hours on a plane, the last part, the part where the plane touched down and she could feel how fast they were going. It made her stomach flip in the best way, eyes closing as she reveled in it. She could almost imagine she was swinging as Spider-Girl. That she was flying through the city. For the remainder of the journey, no one else had really spoken to her. Mr. Stark had checked on her twice to make sure that everything was okay. That she wasn't hungry or thirsty. That she wasn't too cold. And that was nice. She'd have to tell May. For some reason, May didn't seem to completely trust the man. But she trusted Captain Rogers and, it seemed, Miss Potts. She wasn't sure what her aunt had against Mr. Stark, but hopefully, the woman would get used to the idea of Penny interning for him, not to mention all the opportunities that would come with this internship. May had always been protective, and Penny guessed she couldn't really blame her. Penny was all she had left, now. Since her parents and Ben, it had been just May and Penny. And ever since she'd been little, since she'd come to live with her aunt and uncle, May had been her mother. She'd never called her that, but still, that's what she was. She kept tabs on Penny and her friends, had Ned and MJ over, let them stay over whenever they wanted. She did her best to cook and keep the house clean and make sure Penny knew that that apartment with May was her home. So Penny appreciated her protective streak, even when it embarrassed her a little. When they touched down, the plane shook and seemed to shudder, and Penny made sure not to grip the seat too hard, pulling her scarf more firmly around her neck. Sure that everything would be fine, Penny kept her eyes downcast, making sure that no one could tell that she was nervous. Once the plane finally came to a stop, everyone jumped up, Mr. Stark and Miss Potts leading the way, then Rhodey and Natasha, who waited for Penny, Happy trailing behind. Natasha held out an arm, gesturing for Penny to step ahead of her, and she did, smiling back at the woman. There were 2 cars waiting for them at the airport, and the group split up, Happy, Mr. Stark, and Miss Potts heading to one car, the others climbing into the other one. Before she could doubt herself or wonder which car she should go to, Mr. Stark gestured to her. "Come on, kid. You're with me," he called, and, to her surprise, Happy and Miss Potts climbed into the front seat while Mr. Stark got into the back seat with her. Placing her backpack and purse on the floor between her feet, she tightened her scarf, making sure her cardigan was covering her wrists. "Still cold?" he asked, lifting an eyebrow. She shrugged a little sheepishly, hoping that Mr. Stark didn't stop believing that excuse anytime soon. Of course, she really was cold. But more importantly, the bruises on her neck and upper arms needed to stay hidden. "Mind turning up the heat, Hap?" he asked, and Happy did just that. "Thanks," Penny muttered, wishing she could sink into the seat. Disappear. But no one seemed bothered. In the front seat, Miss Potts and Happy spoke about the schedule for the rest of the weekend, and beside her, Mr. Stark pulled out his phone. No one was focused on her. No one was bothered by her. It made her feel better, so she pulled out her own phone, shooting off a text to Ned, and one to May assuring her that she was fine, that they'd landed, and that everyone was being very nice. The car took them straight to the hotel, which was huge. And beautiful. Of course. Penny shouldn't have been surprised. It was Mr. Stark. He wouldn't stay in any kind of hotel if it wasn't 5 stars and more expensive than her rent. As they climbed out of the car, an actual valet stepped forward, dressed in a suit, and took the keys from Happy, while Mr. Stark and Miss Potts led the way into the hotel lobby, the others joining them from the second car. Penny trailed behind, walking behind Natasha as they entered the most beautiful hotel lobby she'd ever seen. There were plants and flowers everywhere, and she could smell them as sharply as if she was standing right next to them. On one table were a whole tray of cookies and a coffee machine with coffee pods and hot chocolate and packets of tea. A tray of small sandwiches. A pitcher of water with glasses. A bin of ice. She let her eyes linger for just a second before hurrying to keep up with the Avengers, feeling like a little kid lagging behind. Mr. Stark checked them in, and they were handed key cards which he passed out. Apart from Mr. Stark and Miss Potts, everyone got their own rooms. Even Penny, all of them on the same floor. Of course, it wasn't a high school field trip. They weren't on a budget. Of course they all had their own rooms. They were on the top floor, with Penny's room between Mr. Stark's room and Natasha's, and it was the woman who entered Penny's room with her, pointing out the balcony, the TV, and the bathroom, letting her know that she would be next door if Penny needed anything. Somehow her bag was already on the king-sized bed, and she dropped her backpack and purse beside it, taking a moment to look around in awe. She'd never been in a hotel room like this. The only hotels she'd ever stayed in had really been motels, and they'd always had to check for bed bugs before laying down. This room had a gigantic balcony. A bathtub almost big enough for her to swim in. A welcome basket full of candy and cookies and packets of tea and chocolate bars with fancy wrappers. Was this for her? The knock on her door came a few seconds later, and without thinking, she opened the door, glad it was just Mr. Stark. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the room and leaning back on his heels. "It's amazing," she answered, voice leaking sincerity. He chuckled a little and nodded. "Yeah, it's not bad." He gave a casual shrug, eyes twinkling as he smiled at her. "You have everything you need." "Oh, yeah, definitely. All right. If you need anything, you can tell me, or Pepper, or call the front desk. You can order room service. Grab whatever you want from the minibar. There's nothing alcoholic in there." Thank you," she started, although there was no way she would ever order room service or take anything from the minibar that he might have to pay for. From the way he was looking at her, it seemed like he knew that. "Sure thing, kid. Really, I won't even check the bill, I swear. Rhodey and Natasha are going to order food, so I won't even know the difference." Penny pressed her lips together, deciding that she'd think about it. Still, she nodded. "All right. Anyway, I brought this." He held out a piece of paper that she took automatically. "This is the schedule for tomorrow and Sunday morning. You'll be with me for most of the morning. Conference starts at 9, so we need to leave the hotel by 8:30. I give a talk at 2, so you can hang around the conference center or explore the city with Happy." He waved a hand. "Whatever you want to do. There should be some pretty interesting stuff at the convention, anyway." "Right. Mr. Stark. What exactly will I be doing?" she wondered. "Follow me. Make sure we get to places on time." He shrugged. "Get me coffee." "Oh, okay," she told him, smiling brightly. He smiled back at her, eyes soft as he rested a hand on her shoulder. Penny noticed that he placed his hand carefully, resting it lightly on her arm. She was glad, but that told her that he had noticed her flinch earlier. That he had seen her. He knew that she was hurt. And it seemed like she was always hurt around him. So he was going to figure out that something was wrong eventually. "All right, kiddo. Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow morning." With a gentle squeeze to her shoulder, he turned and left her alone in the hotel room, shutting the door softly behind him. She'd no hotel. Had never had her own hotel room. It felt very grown up. Grinning to herself, she dropped back on the bed, smiling up at the ceiling and putting a hand over her mouth to contain a giggle, kicking her legs back and forth where they dangled off the bed. Rolling over and grabbing her phone from her purse, she opened up a message to Ned. "Penny. I have my own room at the hotel, where I'm staying with Mr. Stark and Colonel Rhodes and Natasha Romanoff, and Pepper freaking Potts." Then she attached roughly 12 photos of the hotel room, the view from the balcony, and selfies with the minibar. She also sent a text to May, promising her aunt that everything was fine, that her room was amazing, and that everyone had been very nice. Penny and Ned texted for a while, her growling stomach eventually reminding her that she needed to eat. Groaning and dropping her phone beside her, she wiped a hand over her face, wondering if she had enough cash to get something at the vending machine. Right as she was about to grab her wallet, there was a knock on her door. Frowning and gripping her phone, she jumped off the bed and peered through the peephole before opening it to a man dressed in a uniform holding a tray. "Miss Parker?" "Yes?" He gestured to the tray and she stepped aside to let him in. He placed the tray on the bedside table. "Can I get anything else for you?" "Oh, no thanks. But, thank you." He nodded, then headed out, and she stared from the door to the tray, then pulled off the lid. There was a plate of fancy-looking pasta, garlic bread, and a pastry, along with a bottle of water and a bottle of soda. Beside the plate was a note that she picked up, smiling a little at Mr. Stark's handwriting. "Penny, I could hear your stomach growling from my room. Eat up. I'll see you in the morning." With a smile, she climbed into bed, grabbing the plate and practically scarfing down the food. Once she was done, she left the tray on the dresser, then scooted under the covers, grabbing her phone, and scrolling through social media and texting with Ned until she finally fell asleep, but not before quadruple checking her alarm. The alarm woke her at 7 a.m., and she had to fight not to slam her finger down on the snooze button. Instead, she rolled herself out of bed and headed for the shower. Climbing in, she turned the water to warm, then hot, then practically boiling, then cool again to wake herself up. Thankfully, almost all of her bruises were gone, so she didn't worry too much about wearing a short-sleeved blouse under her cardigan and scarf. She forewent the gloves, just wrapped the scarf around her neck and then sat on her bed, waiting for someone to come get her. It was Mr. Stark who came to get her, knock at her door at 8:20 and smiling a bit when she answered the door barely a second later. "Morning, Mr. Stark." She greeted, her voice a little breathless with the surprise that this was actually happening. She was actually here. In Washington, D.C. As Mr. Stark's intern. "Good morning. Ready?" She nodded, pulling the paper out of her purse and holding it up. "All right. Let's get going." When they stepped into the conference center, it was immediately too loud, and Penny had to close her eyes, taking a deep breath and trying to focus on Mr. Stark in front of her and the feel of her cardigan on her hand and the sound of her own heartbeat. Breathing deeply, she blinked the spots away from her eyes and forced herself to step forward behind Mr. Stark. Rhodey and Natasha going ahead too. Okay. Penny wasn't sure. But Miss Potts had a meeting somewhere close by, which left Penny with Mr. Stark. He led her over to a coffee stand, pulling out his wallet and ordering a large black coffee, then gestures to Penny. What do you want, Pen? But, Mr. Stark, aren't I supposed to be getting your coffee? He gave a careless shrug as the person working the coffee cart stared at her mentor strangely. Probably. What do you want? Oh, chai? Large chai. He handed over his cart and the man made their drinks. There was something in the ad he was looking at her boss that she didn't like. Something that made her skin crawl. Still, Mr. Stark waited until the barista had placed the drinks on the counter before he grabbed them, handing one to Penny. She sipped the wonderfully warm drink as they walked, him leading the way as they made their way over to the exhibits. She shouldn't have been surprised that there were so many clean energy and robots and plants. Research on everything from technology used to clean water to advanced weapons. Mr. Stark didn't stop at any of the ones with weapons, and she vaguely remembered that he'd made weapons himself. Back before Iron Man. But he hadn't made weapons in a long time. Still, he avoided that section of the expo, steering Penny over to the other exhibits and occasionally introducing her to other scientists. Most of them were men around his age. They were all polite, reaching out and shaking her hand and asking about his internship program. She gave them all the same general overview, not mentioning anything about the private internship or the spider suit, of course. None of them had even heard of Spider-Girl anyway, she was sure of it. They all met in the cafeteria for lunch, Natasha, Rhodey, and Miss Potts joining her and Mr. Stark at a table. There were food stalls and booths everywhere, and Natasha placed a hand on her shoulder. What do you think? She asked, jutting her chin toward the cluster where everyone was gathering to get food. We've got Chinese food, burgers, Thai. Thai sounds good. Do you like Tahi? Penny nodded, trying to come to terms with the fact that Natasha Romanoff had an arm around her shoulders. Not quite protective. But not protective either. What about you guys? Everyone agreed easily, and Mr. Stark and Miss Potts led them over to the Thai stand where they got in line. There was a pretty dense crowd of scientists and visitors and what Penny assumed were other interns, and she found herself between Natasha and Rhodey, nearly pressed to the woman's side. As she glanced around the crowded room, she hesitated on a familiar face. She knew that man. Had seen him on a field trip. Norman Osborn. Talking to someone she'd also seen before. Penny. She jumped, looking up to find that they had moved to the front of the line and that they were all waiting for her to order. Natasha touched a hand to her back and she glanced up at the menu before choosing a dish at random. Food was the last thing on her mind, but she knew she had to eat something or her metabolism would turn on her. So she grabbed her food when it was ready, then followed the adults to their table. So, what do you think of the conference? Rhodey wondered, taking a bite of his noodles. It's amazing. I've only ever been to one big expo, and I didn't really get to see a lot of it before. Well, the robots started attacking people. There was a pause. A heavy, stunned silence. Then Natasha lifted an eyebrow. You were at that expo? How old were you? 7 or 8. She shrugged. My aunt and uncle took me. Mr. Stark, you actually. Tony Stark. Penny jumped a little, all of them turning to find Norman Osborn standing beside their table. A hand held out that Mr. Stark seemed to reluctantly take. So good to see you. And Miss Potts. Hello, Norman. She greeted with a tight smile, shaking his hand as well. All of the adults shook his hand, standing from their places at the table, and then he turned to her. Of course, she told herself when her hands shook under the table, he wouldn't remember her. No way. She had only met him once on a field trip, and they hadn't even really met. They'd stood in the same room. And she'd been with almost 100 other students. So, she told herself firmly as she stood, taking the hand he offered, there was no way he remembered her. Thankfully, she was right. Norman, this is Penny Parker, my intern, Mr. Stark introduced. So nice to meet you, Miss Parker. Mr. Osborn greeted, squeezing her hand not to squeeze too hard, firm grip. He still commented with a little smirk. Nice to meet you too, Mr. Osborn. I didn't know you had interns, Stark. It's a relatively new program, Miss Potts informed him. I'll have to give it a shot. Maybe I could find some young talent. What do you pay them, Stark? I'll have Pepper send you the specifics. Mr. Stark told him, voice dry and almost irritated. Thankfully, the man seemed to realize that they were trying to eat and that his presence wasn't exactly welcome, leaving them alone once more. Mr. Stark sighed, rolling his eyes and picking up his fork again, muttering what sounded like, pompous prick, under his breath. Penny bit back a laugh when Miss Potts elbowed him, making him release an off and flinch. Penny couldn't help it. She followed Norman Osborn with her eyes, glancing over at him and watching him melt back into the crowd. Something was wrong. Something about Norman Osborn. And the man he'd been talking to. Grabbing her purse, Penny stood. I'm going to run to the bathroom. Natasha started to stand too, but Penny waved her off a little, smiling with what she hoped was assurance. I know where it is. I'll be right back. And, turning, she slipped into the crowd, senses on high alert, heading in the direction that Osborn had disappeared in. The conference part 2. It was easy to lose herself in the crowd. No one paid attention to a teenage girl at a science conference, especially not during lunchtime when they were all on their way to get food. She slipped between the men hurrying toward the food stalls and vendors with carts, using her senses to make sure no one was following her. Or watching her. She was pretty sure Mr. Stark had believed her. It had been a convincing lie. Plus, she could always say she got lost on her way to the bathroom, buying her a few extra minutes. Shifting her purse on her shoulder, she glanced around, easily spotting Mr. Osborn. He was approaching the barista from the coffee cart. Pausing, she flinched when someone ran into her. Watch it. The man ordered, and she apologized under her breath, jerking away from him and heading closer to Mr. Osborn and the coffee cart guy, keeping her eyes off of them, but keeping her ears open. At first, it was difficult to isolate the sounds of their voices over the dull roar of other voices, but the closer she got, the easier it was. A coffee? Yes, with his intern. Frowning, she glanced back at the crowd, making sure no one was watching her. On the other side of the food carts, she was pretty much out of view, although all anyone had to do was glance around one to see her. She messed with her purse, opening it as if she was looking for something. Stark is slated to speak in an hour or two. If he sends his intern, Mr. Osborn trailed off and Penny felt a jolt go up her spine. Glancing up, she realized that Mr. Osborn was looking at her. Not in her direction. Directly at her, eyes narrowing. Pulling out her phone and turning away from Mr. Osborn, she made her way toward the bathroom on the far wall. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. Footsteps that were approaching her too rapidly to just be any random person. They were following her. But the bathrooms were only a few hundred feet away, so she hurried toward them, refusing to glance over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid. Osborn couldn't do anything to her. Not really. Not only could she easily defend herself against a regular human, she was also surrounded by people who, presumably, wouldn't let anyone hurt a teenage girl. And Mr. Stark and Natasha and Rhodey were all waiting for her, along with Happy and Miss Potts. So she wasn't exactly worried. What she wanted to do was find out what Mr. Osborn had been talking about. He obviously didn't like Mr. Stark. Did that mean he would plan to do something to him? Surely not. Surely he wouldn't hurt him, or try to poison him or anything. Penny felt stupid for even thinking it. She had probably been watching too many murder mysteries on TV. In the real world, there was no way that renowned scientists plotted to kill their rivals at a conference by poisoning their coffee. Still, she vowed to be especially careful when getting him coffee from then on. Penny slipped into the women's bathroom and washed her hands, fixing her hair and putting on chapstick, mostly to kill time. Then, not wanting Mr. Stark or the others to worry, she left the bathroom. And she wasn't really all that surprised to see Norman Osborn waiting for her. She wasn't happy about it. Her heart rate spiked, and she found herself glancing toward the crowds, but no one really looked their way. "Mr. Osborn?" she asked, making her voice level. Calm but slightly surprised. Calling on every scrap of acting talent she'd ever possessed, she forced a smile. When she started to move toward the open area where the tables were set up, where Mr. Stark surely was starting to wonder where she was, the man moved just slightly, blocking her path. She stopped short, not liking how close he was. "Forgive me. I didn't quite catch your name." "Penny," She told him a little loudly, despite the fact that they'd been introduced not 10 minutes ago. He waited so, reluctantly, she gave her last name too. Just a little louder than a normal conversation. She wanted people to hear. Wanted people to know that he was talking to her. "Well, Miss Parker, I just wanted to speak to you regarding your internship with Tony Stark." He moved a little closer and she fought the urge to take a step back. She wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidated. "What, exactly, did you want to know?" The voice startled them both, and Penny turned to find Mr. Stark and Miss Romanoff both standing a few feet away and approaching rapidly enough that even Penny was a little intimidated. Natasha came to a stop beside her, giving Penny a quick smile before turning to Mr. Osborn, who was staring at Mr. Stark, jaw tight. "Because I would be happy to answer any questions you have about my internship program, Norman. Or, better yet, why don't you check the website?" A hand touched Penny's shoulder, and Natasha nodded her head toward the bathroom. Penny followed the woman, the two of them pausing by the sink. After glancing in all 4 stalls to make sure the room was empty, there weren't a ton of women at the convention. Natasha crossed her arms. "What were you doing?" "Going to the bathroom," Penny told her, glancing at the bathroom door and speaking slowly, doing her best to fake confusion. The super spy didn't buy it, lifting an eyebrow and staring. She didn't look upset, exactly. More curious. "I got turned around on the way." "You're not a terrible liar," the woman observed softly. "Not a great one, but not terrible." Penny wasn't sure what to say to that, but Natasha kept going, saving her from having to answer. "Why were you following Norman Osborn?" Penny hesitated, trying to figure out if giving something close to the truth would incriminate her in any way. Should she chance it? Natasha was staring at her, face almost neutral, and Penny sighed, giving in. "He was talking to the guy from this morning. The coffee guy." The spy tilted her head, lips pursed. He was saying something about Mr. Stark's coffee. He said that if Mr. Stark sent me to get him coffee again." She shrugged. "He saw me listening so he stopped talking." "Did he say anything to you?" Penny shook her head. "Not really, just said he wanted to ask me something." Natasha stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Tell me if he says anything else to you. We'll make sure he doesn't bother you." Penny blinked a few times. She had to admit, she was surprised. She hadn't expected the woman to come to her aid so quickly, despite the fact that she hadn't really needed help. Still, it was nice, and she wasn't going to explain why exactly she didn't need Natasha to protect her from Norman Osborn. "And I'll keep an eye on the barista." Okay. Thank you," she murmured, clasping her hands together, eyes dropping to the floor. She hadn't really thought the woman would believe her. She'd assumed that they'd think she was imagining things or being silly. May probably would have. Natasha continued to watch her, though, and Penny had no idea what the woman was thinking. How was she supposed to keep anything a secret with Natasha Romanoff watching her? "Of course." Natasha touched her shoulder gently, finally smiling a little. "Let's get back out there before the men start to worry." When they left the bathroom, Mr. Stark was alone, looking vaguely put out, eyes trained on the crowd. For a moment, Penny worried that he was upset with her for taking too long. But when he turned to face her, there was only worry. "Everything okay?" he asked, moving a bit closer. "Everything's fine," Natasha assured him, her eyes cutting over to Penny for just a moment. "And Osborn?" "I told him where he could direct his questions." Something in his tone made Penny's lips twitch, but she kept her eyes down until the man approached, a hand reaching out to her shoulder. Natasha chose that moment to head back to the table where Penny assumed the others waited. "Kid? Are you okay? Really?" "Of course. Yeah. I'm fine. He just surprised me." He seemed to believe her, nodding but still regarding her closely. Your speech, Mr. Stark. It's almost time." She told him, ready to change the subject. Nothing good could CNG her too closely. The man nodded, checking his watch. "The speech is in half an hour in conference room B. Grab me a coffee from the place down the street, would you? The one we passed coming here." "Oh, of course." He pulled out his wallet, handing her a 20. "Get yourself something too, and meet me backstage." She nodded, eyes wide. "Conference room B is on the 3rd floor. Biggest room. Can't miss it." She nodded again, watching as he turned and headed back to their table where Natasha and Rhodey waited. Hurrying off to get his coffee, she slipped out of the building, wondering if he was having her get the coffee from somewhere else because he was worried about Mr. Osborne. What had the man started to say about his coffee? Why did they hate each other so much? Of course, it had never been explicitly stated, but she'd been able to tell from their quick conversation, from the way they'd stared at one another, that they hated each other. She would have to do some research, she decided, stepping into the coffee shop across the street. There was a line almost to the door, and impatiently, she took her place, foot tapping as she glanced at her watch, a familiar anxiety curling up in her stomach. She couldn't be late. Not to get Mr. Stark his coffee. Not for the one thing he'd asked of her. The line inched forward, and Penny glanced around, then back at her watch, throat getting a little tight as she shot off a text to Ned, asking how he was doing just to have something to do. "Excuse me?" Penny jumped, turning to find a tall, dark-haired boy standing beside her. "Are you Tony Stark's intern?" Her senses were pretty quiet. Well, as much as they could be considering her general anxiety. "Yes," she answered slowly, glancing around. No one was paying any attention to her, but she was in a public space. Public spaces were safe. Why? "Oh, sorry." He held out a hand. "Harry." She shook the hand, hesitant. "Harry Osborne." Slowly, she nodded. "I saw you and Mr. Stark at the expo earlier, but I didn't get a chance to say hi. It's nice to meet you." "Penny Parker. And you too," she told him, forcing a smile and glancing at her watch. "What do you think of the expo?" "It's really cool," she told him, the most non-committal thing she could think of saying. This was Harry Osborne. She'd heard of him, of course. The son of Norman Osborn, whose spider had made her what she was. There wasn't any reason she could think of to get close to this guy. Still, she also couldn't think of any way to politely end the conversation, so she would keep her answers short, she decided. He nodded, not seeming to notice her hesitance. "Yeah, my dad never lets me come to this stuff. But I kept bugging him until he said yes. Isn't Mr. Stark giving a speech soon?" "I'm getting him coffee," she explained as they moved up. "You've still got a little time," he assured her, even though she had been trying to hide her worry, smiling at her almost gently. He was handsome, she thought absently, trying not to look at his face directly. "How long have you been working for him?" She tugged at her scarf, tightening it a little. "Not long. A few months." "What's it like?" She started to answer, but then she was at the front of the line, ordering Mr. Stark a large coffee and herself a smoothie. Figuring she'd lay off the caffeine, she stepped to the side, waiting for her order. So, he continued their conversation and she realized he hadn't ordered anything. "What's it like, working for Tony Stark?" "Oh, it's fine. We get to work in the lab a lot," she told him, not wanting to get into specifics. Just then, her name was called, so she grabbed her drinks and shot Harry a smile. "It was nice to meet you." He grinned, leaning against a table and crossing his arms. "You too, Penny Parker." Conference room B was easy to find, and once she showed them her Stark Industries badge, they were quick to let her come backstage where Mr. Stark waited, eyes skimming a piece of paper that she assumed were his notes. Did Mr. Stark need notes? She'd just assumed that he was so brilliant that he could just make up all his speeches on the spot. "Thanks, kid." He took the coffee, gesturing for Penny to take a seat and waving away the change she tried to hand him. "Don't worry about it." "Mr. Stark?" she asked, not wanting to bother him before he gave a speech, and knowing that she shouldn't be bothering him with things like this. It really wasn't any of her business. Still, she asked and he looked up, expression friendly enough. "Open. Listening." "Was Mr. Osborne? Does he?" She tried to think about how best to ask, but the door to the backstage opened and he stood. "Don't worry about Norman Osborn, Penny. He's a second-rate scientist, and after tomorrow I probably won't see him again until the next one of these that Pepper manages to drag me through. You're welcome to look around the conference for a while. This should only take an hour." And with that, he was on stage, waving a hand as the lights all flashed to him. Knowing that this might be her only chance to see Mr. Stark give a speech like this live, she found a spot right off stage where she wasn't in the way to watch. Mr. Stark was different on stage. With her, he was quiet, almost careful, endlessly patient and attentive. On stage, he was loud, dynamic, hands moving and posturing, his whole body constantly in motion. And she could tell that the crowd was eating it up. It was hard not to. She was getting sucked in too. He was brilliant. The best mentor she could have ever asked for. He was her teacher and he actually liked her. But if he ever found out who she really was, that she'd lied to him, could he ever forgive that? When Mr. Stark finished his speech, he lifted his hands, thanking the audience for their thunderous applause, and then turned back, heading in her direction. He faltered for a moment when he spotted her, eyes widening a little, and then he softened, smiling as he headed in her direction. "Didn't know you were still back here." He took the bottle of water she held out to him with a nod of thanks. "Figured you'd take the opportunity to do some exploring. Maybe find another internship with someone better," he joked, taking a drink of the water. "There is no one better," she told him, laughing a little, voice earnest, and he paused, seeming startled for a moment before he looked away, shaking his head a little and sniffing, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, Penny, what's next on the schedule?" he asked, gesturing to her paper. That's the only speech today. You have another speech tomorrow morning before the showcase. Right now, there's still exhibits downstairs, and a Dr. Octavius who is talking about." She frowned at the paper, then froze. "Wait. Should I be calling you Dr. Stark?" she asked, wide-eyed, and he snorted. "No, definitely not. And Dr. Octavius's research is a dead end. He just doesn't know it yet." The man waved a hand, then gestured for Penny to keep reading. "The expo will be going on for a few more hours. You can look at more of the exhibits downstairs. They're closing at 5, so you would have time. What do you think? Have we seen everything worth seeing?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. Me too. Too bad we can't show off your webs." Penny's heart stopped, then seemed to block her throat. Lifting her eyebrows, she shook her head. They aren't my webs," she told him, voice a bit too high-pitched. He frowned, narrowing his eyes as he stared closely at her. "Spider-Girl's webs." He corrected himself with a shrug. "You were able to duplicate them." "But she invented them. Or someone did for her," she shrugged back. "I can't take credit for her work." He smiled, reaching out and patting her on the shoulder. "You're right. That would be amoral. I guess it's too bad that we couldn't show off your suit." "You designed that." He shook his head. "You did most of the work. I just provided you with the resources. I think we can make a prototype in the next week or two. Get started on this thing for Ray. Just give it to her?" Penny asked, voice skeptical. "What if she's like crazy? Or what if she turns evil?" He chuckled. "If she turns evil, then I'll have to try and stop her from destroying the world, I guess." She smiled a little when he did. He gestured for her to follow him then, the two of them making their way out of the backstage area. "The plan is to keep some of the features under lock and key. Just give her the basics." She nodded. He definitely mentioned that before. But she wondered if there would be a way to hack into the suit and unlock all of the features without him finding out. He would show her how he hid them, so theoretically, it wouldn't be hard. Mr. Stark must have texted the others because everyone was waiting for them outside of the elevator. She noticed that all Mr. Stark had asked her to do was get him coffee once. He could have read his own schedule. She was sure that Happy could have kept his schedule straight. Gotten him coffee, he didn't need her. But he'd invited her anyway. "Mr. Stark?" she asked before they reached the group waiting for them by the elevator. He turned, humming in question. "Thank you, for letting me come." He smiled, putting a hand on her shoulder and patting gently. "Of course, kid. Who else is going to get my coffee? Keep track of my schedule? Carry my briefcase?" She laughed a little. "I haven't carried your briefcase, and I only got you coffee once. The night is young. And my briefcase is empty. I only brought it to look impressive." He shrugged, and she glanced down at the briefcase, wondering if he was lying or not. "All right, everyone." He clapped his hands, nodding to the others. The only one not there was Miss Potts, who apparently had another meeting nearby. She always seemed to be busy. "We've seen everything worth seeing here. Let's show the kid around DC." Natasha was the first to smile. "Sounds great." The others followed suit. The rest of the day was spent exploring DC with Mr. Stark, Rhodey, and Natasha, eating dinner at a restaurant fancier than any place she'd ever been in, then heading back to the hotel. Happy stayed at the conference since Miss Potts had more meetings which would, according to Mr. Stark, be over around 6. Rhodey asked Penny what she thought of the exhibits as they drove, and she found herself telling him which ones she'd liked the best, him listening with a smile he shot back over his shoulder. Mr. Stark was driving, and Natasha sat beside her in the back seat, knees against Mr. Stark's seat, head thrown back, tilted slightly so she could watch Penny talk. They were being so nice to her. It felt like she could relax. Take a breath. Let her guard down, just a little. So she did, smiling and laughing and letting her scarf unwind a little. The bruises on her neck were healed anyway. They wouldn't see anything. So she pulled it off right after dinner, stuffing it in her purse and enjoying the warm air of the car surrounded by the people she wanted to be like. The ones that she looked up to. Had looked up to for so long. That evening, when they dropped her off at her room, Mr. Stark again promising that she was welcome to order room service, she dropped on her bed, staring at the ceiling and smiling like an idiot. These people. The Avengers. She was getting to know them. Her, Penny Parker. Some nobody from Queens. She was getting to spend time with the Avengers. With Tony Stark. He was teaching her and the others were looking out for her, and although it didn't make any sense, although it seemed absolutely crazy that this was her life, it was. Pulling out her phone, she dialed May, ready to tell her aunt all about it. Well, almost all of it. She'd leave out the part about Norman Osborn. The conference part 3. Penny woke early the next morning, stretching and yawning and glancing at her phone. It was 6 a.m., an hour before she needed to get up. 2 hours before she needed to leave. Rolling over and snuggling into her pillow, curled up in the middle of her king-sized bed, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. They'd cleaned her room while she'd been gone. Penny couldn't remember the last time she'd stayed in an actual hotel, much less one this nice. Maybe never. She took her phone and started scrolling through it when she couldn't get back to sleep. There wasn't anything new on social media, so she dropped it back on her pillow and groaned, closing her eyes again. It didn't work. Groaning again, she got out of bed, opening her bag and grabbing her clothes for the day, deciding to take a long shower. A long, hot shower. It felt luxurious and wonderful, and by the time it was over, she was at least more awake. Dressing in her blouse and slacks and throwing on a pair of flats, she grimaced when her stomach growled. Sighing and starting to go to her bag to see if there was anything to eat in there, she froze when her phone vibrated. Abandoning her hunt for food, she picked up the phone, dropping onto her stomach to read the text message. "You awake yet?" Smiling a bit at Mr. Stark's name at the top of the screen, she replied, "Yes, sir." Drop the sir and open the door. Giggling a little, she hopped up, smoothing her shirt and pausing. She was wearing a short-sleeved blouse, and for the most part, all of the bruising was gone. Maybe a slightly darker spot right under her sleeve. Otherwise, there was almost nothing. Deciding to leave her cardigan thrown over the chair for the moment, she headed over to the door, opening it to find Miss Potts and Mr. Stark. "We thought we'd have breakfast before we went. Unless you want to get something at the convention center?" Miss Potts asked, smiling gently at her. The woman was the CEO of Stark Industries. She ran a company and press conferences and famously corralled Mr. Stark into meetings. But she was always kind to Penny, always gentle. "Oh, of course, did. Did you want to?" Penny glanced behind her, very aware of the fact that she wasn't wearing a cardigan. Or a scarf. Just a short-sleeved shirt. Like a normal person. "You're a normal person," she told herself harshly. "Just act normal, they don't know." "That's sweet of you, but we already have a room set up down the hall." One of the perks of renting out the whole floor. Penny lifted her eyebrows in surprise. She had noticed that it had been quiet. Quieter than she'd expected a hotel to be, but she hadn't suspected the reason why. Shutting her door behind her and making sure she had her phone and her keycard, she followed Miss Potts and Mr. Stark down the hall to another room where she found Happy, Natasha, and Rhodey all sitting around the breakfast table. Lounging. Laughing. Chatting. Like normal people. Superheroes who were normal people who were inviting her to join them. "Hey, kid. Pull up a chair." The Colonel invited, gesturing to a seat on his side of the table. Hesitating only for a second, she sat down beside him, muttering her thanks when she was given a plate. They were all dressed for the day, and she wondered exactly they would all be doing at the conference. Mr. Stark, she knew, had a speech later in the morning, and although the convention went until the evening, she wasn't sure how late they were staying. She also had no idea how to ask. They ate their breakfast, Penny feeling less and less awkward. Less out of place. It was hard to feel awkward with them when every few minutes someone asked her a question. Asked her opinion. Asked about school. Invited her to join the conversation. She did, less and less nervous about saying something completely stupid. Breakfast took almost an hour. An hour of conversation and these people. She was seeing more and more that these people were almost like family. Mr. Stark and Miss Potts, of course, but also Rhodey and Natasha and Happy. They were one another's family. When breakfast was over, they left their dishes stacked on the table, then went to their own rooms to grab their things. Miss Potts assured Penny that she didn't have to bring her luggage with her. Happy would make sure everything was put in a car before it was time to go. Grabbing her purse and making sure she had the paper with Mr. Stark's schedule, although she doubted he actually needed it. Still, she would have it, just in case. This time, Mr. Stark brought his coffee in his thermos from the hotel, offering to get her something too, but she politely declined. Once more, they split up, Mr. Stark and Penny heading for the huge room set up with exhibits. It was fairly full of people considering how early it was, and Penny found herself once more being introduced as Mr. Stark's intern to people whose names she would never remember. Still, she smiled and shook the hands of the old men who smiled at her and told them how nice it was to meet them. They asked about her internship and she gave them the barest details. Then they would make some kind of joke about Mr. Stark never having interns before. It was an hour before they ran into Norman Osborn again among the crowds of people gathering around booths showcasing new inventions and technology, some of which was impressive, some not. Penny had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that they would run into him. That she would see Harry Osborn again. Still, she felt a flutter of surprise. A strange feeling along her spine as she came face to face with the boy her age. He grinned at her, flashing bright, white teeth, and she wondered if the feeling was her spider senses or just regular nervousness. Mr. Osborn held out a hand to Mr. Stark, who took it with a barely repressed sigh. Norman. Good morning, Tony. I don't believe you've met my son. This is Harry. With a slightly more genuine smile, Mr. Stark shook Harry's hand. Nice to meet you, Mr. Stark. You too, Harry. Mr. Stark gestured to her. And this is Penny, my intern. Yeah, we've met, Harry told him with an almost amused grin, holding out a hand that she sighed before taking. What's up, Penny Parker? Hi. Mr. Osborn lifted an eyebrow, but it was Mr. Stark who spoke. You know each other? He wondered, somewhat hesitantly. He was at the coffee shop yesterday. Penny cut in, not liking the direction this conversation was taking or the shit-eating grin on Harry's face. He'd been nice enough, but he was Norman Osborn's son, and she didn't trust Norman Osborn. Neither, apparently, did Mr. Stark. Her mentor hummed, glancing between her and Harry. We're heading back to New York in a few hours. What about you? Harry asked her, as if she were in charge of anything. Before she could come up with an answer, however, Mr. Stark cut in. I'm not sure yet, he told Harry as if the boy had been asking him. We'll see how my speech goes. I'm sure Pep will have some people for me to talk to afterward. Turning back to Penny, he inclined his head toward the far side of the room. Come on, Pen. I want to introduce you to Dr. Howard. He's done some great things in robots. Norman. Harry, it was nice to meet you. Penny nodded to them, following obediently along. She waited until they were at least 100 feet away and moving back toward the other side of the room to ask who Dr. Howard was. No one. I just hate talking to Norman Osborn. She snorted, unable to hold back the laugh, and he chuckled. We went to Oscorp once. She told him before really thinking it through. Immediately, she cursed herself, but she'd already piqued his interest. Seriously? Why? He asked, pulling a face that made her laugh once more. The two stepped to the side of one of the rows of displays so they wouldn't be in the way. She was glad. Glad they were out of the way and glad that it was a little quieter. 2 days of these crowds and it was starting to be. Well, a lot. She'd downed some ibuprofen the day before, but thankfully her senses hadn't been field trip. Penny shrugged. We got a tour of the labs and stuff. Why didn't you come to Stark Industries? She shrugged again. I'll have to talk to your school. Oscorp. Honestly. What are you supposed to learn in a place like that? Feeling a smirk take over her face, she made her voice innocent. Soft. I don't know. The labs looked pretty impressive to me. His jaw dropped, and she giggled. This is the thanks I get. He gestured grandly, using both hands. I give you breakfast, I teach you to build robots. I already knew how, and you call Oscorp impressive. He shook his head in faux disgust, a smile finally breaking through when she laughed again. All right, kid. Anything else you want to see? I think we've seen just about everything minus the weapons dealers downstairs. Wait, are there seriously weapons dealers here? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. There are weapons dealers everywhere, Penny. I make it a point to avoid them. You ready to head to the conference room? They'd been walking around for over an hour, so she nodded. It had been amazing, but honestly, she would always prefer seeing Mr. Stark work to watching anyone else. Plus, she was starting to get a headache. The room was loud, crowded, full of so many sounds and smells and other humans pushing against her. Rubbing a hand over her eyes, she hurried along behind Mr. Stark, who glanced back at her as he walked, slowing a bit so that she could keep up. You good? He asked. She nodded, trotting along after him as they reached the elevator. Yeah, all good, she promised. His second talk was in the same room as before, and Penny once more found herself backstage as he glanced through a few pages of notes. The backstage area was dark and relatively quiet, so she took a seat on one of the sofas, stretching a little and closing her eyes. You sure you're good? Mr. Stark asked, voice soft in the quiet of the backstage. She nodded. Here. Penny opened her eyes once more and found a bottle of water being held out to her. Oh. Thank you. She smiled, opening it and draining half. I think we'll head back to New York after my speech. He took a drink of his own bottle, sitting beside her on the sofa. What did you think of the expo? It was amazing. She glanced at the stage that she could just see the corner of from where she sat. You know, I've been thinking about your internship. Her heart plummeted. Had she done something wrong? Messed something up? Was he going to send her back down to the internship lab now that they were pretty much done with Spider-Girl's suit? We're just about done with our project. So I was considering moving on to something else. To someone else. She was sure he was going to say it. That he was going to tell her he was going to ask another intern to help him in his lab. It would only be fair. Really? She'd prioritized enough of his time. The other interns deserved a chance. Deserved the opportunity to work with Mr. Stark. I did most of the heavy lifting on the AI we built. How about next time, you take the lead? She blinked at him, jaw dropping a little. It was true. He'd done most of the actual coding for the AI in her. In Spider-Girl's suit. And yes, he'd walked her through the process and taught her what to do, but he'd done almost all of the real work. But if she got the chance to code an AI, to create something like that from scratch, that kind of experience was invaluable. Especially since she could put it on a college application. She would get into MIT. Surely. If she could program her own AI, what else could Mr. Stark teach her? Anything. The man was a genius. He knew everything there was about programming. About engineering and building robots and everything, kid? Did I break you? He asked with a snort. Penny blinked again, then smiled. Yes, he lifted his eyebrows. I mean, no, you didn't break me, but, yeah, that would be amazing. Mr. Stark grinned, reaching out and patting her shoulder. Sounds good. All right, kid. I've got to go talk to these people about something or another. He waved a hand. I'll wing it. She laughed as he pulled himself to his feet, nodding to the man that had come to let him know it was time. She drank the rest of her water as he stepped out onto the stage, and she closed her eyes, dropping her head against the back of the sofa, feeling her head pound in time with Mr. Stark's voice. He sounded far off. The speakers were all pointed the other direction toward the crowd. Still, the sound seemed to vibrate her, and, flinching, she placed her hands over her ears, leaning forward, head in her hands, elbows on her knees. She stayed that way for a while. Listened to Mr. Stark's faraway voice and wondered if it would be safe to take more ibuprofen. Probably not yet. You okay, Penny Parker? Penny jumped, eyes going wide, a jolt going up her spine. Harry Osborn was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised. How did, she started, jumping to her feet. Her head gave a corresponding pound, and she had to fight the urge to sit right back down. To curl up and take a tap and hope that it would be gone by the time she woke up. How did you get back here? She asked, not loving the smirk on his face. He looked cocky. He was cocky, she guessed. The son of Norman Osborn. He was bound to be a bit of an ass. Just showed the security guard my badge. She lifted an eyebrow. So, how long are you going to be here? Mr. Stark said we're heading back after his speech, Penny told him, arms crossed. My dad said that we're not heading back until tonight, so I guess this is goodbye for now? I guess. She told him, lifting an eyebrow. Mr. Stark was still talking and she wondered if he was winding down. For some reason, she didn't want him to see who she had been talking to. Didn't want him to know that Harry Osborn was back here talking to her. He wasn't supposed to be there. She was sure of that. And although it wasn't her fault that he'd gotten backstage, she still felt like she was doing something wrong. Maybe we'll run into each other in New York? Where do you go to school? How do you get back here? Penny stiffened, as did Harry, the two of them turning to find Natasha leaning in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. She was still, and she regarded Harry with an almost blank expression, and Penny felt a twinge go down her spine. Danger. Natasha was dangerous. Not to her, necessarily. But it was something to remember. She couldn't get too close. It wasn't safe. The closer she got to them, the better the chances of them finding out who she was. But they'd been kind to her. Maybe they wouldn't hate her for lying to them. Maybe. Harry faltered a little, glancing over at Penny as if she was going to save him. Rolling her eyes, Penny moved back over to the sofa, figuring that Natasha had it covered. Rubbing her fingers into her temples, she closed her eyes. I'd better get back to my dad. I'll see you around, Penny Parker. She hummed, waving a lazy hand at him. After a moment, Natasha sat on the couch beside her. Are you all right? She hummed in agreement. Was he bothering you? Penny opened her eyes at the woman's tone. No, he's annoying, but it's fine. The very last thing she felt like dealing with was Harry Osborn. It wasn't like she didn't have enough troubles, the woman laughed. Headache? She asked, voice soft and sympathetic. Penny shrugged, not wanting to admit to it. How could she explain sensory overload to the woman without explaining her powers? Shrugging out of her cardigan, she glanced over at the stage. It sounded like Mr. Stark was wrapping up his speech. She'd be glad to go somewhere quieter. Somewhere without so many people around, despite how amazing the convention had been. Have you taken anything? No, Penny told her. It wasn't like she could explain that the pain meds that had once worked for her didn't anymore. The spy dug into the bag slung around her shoulder, pulling out a bottle of Advil. She handed Penny a new bottle of water from the mini-fridge. When the woman's back was turned, Penny dumped 5 pills into her hand, hoping that would put a dent in her pain, and was careful to hide them in her palm before Natasha turned around. Mr. Stark joined them, leaving the stage to thunderous applause, right as Penny was swallowing the pills. He hesitated, looking between Natasha and Penny, but he and Natasha exchanged some kind of look and he didn't ask any questions. Instead, he held his hand out and Natasha tossed him another water. I need coffee, he declared, and Penny jumped to her feet. Sure. He softened for a moment, sharing another look with Natasha. I can get it, Penny. It's my only job, Mr. Stark. You won't even let me carry your suitcase. The man snorted, shaking his head and giving a reluctant smile. The place across the street? Fine. But here. He started to get his wallet out, but she waved him off. I still have some of the money you gave me yesterday. If you were smart, you'd keep that. She gave him a horrified look that made both Natasha and Mr. Stark laugh out loud. Yeah. You're a better person than I ever was, kid. Do you have enough to get yourself something too? Yes. Do you want anything, Natasha? No thank you. The woman waved her off, and, grabbing her purse, Penny hurried off to get his coffee, glad to have the chance to get out of the convention center. A dark, silent room in her apartment would have been better, but she'd take what she could get. We'll meet you at the entrance, Penny. The noise from the convention center matched the dull pounding in her head, and she fought the urge to close her eyes, hurrying out of the building and onto the street. The sound of taxis and car horns and people talking got louder as she stepped outside, and Penny groaned, rubbing a hand over her eyes, wishing the Advil would do something. Anything. Still, she pushed it back, ordering Mr. Stark a coffee and herself a hot chocolate before heading back to the conference center where Mr. Stark and Natasha waited outside with Happy, all of them leaning on a car. Oh. Happy. I'm sorry. I would have brought you, She started, handing over Mr. Stark's coffee. Buddyman waved her off. "I get my own coffee, kid," he told her, voice a little gruff as always. Still, he shot her a smile as he opened the back door for her, and she thanked him as she slipped inside the blessedly dark back seat. The windows were all tinted, and she released a breath, letting her head fall back against the headrest. Mr. Stark slid in beside her, and the partition went up between the front and back seats. Turning to him with a frown, she was surprised when he pulled off his shades. "You need a doctor?" he asked, eyes nothing but serious. "What? No. I'm fine, Mr. Stark," she assured him, tightening her cardigan a little. He stayed on his side of the car as if making sure she knew he wasn't going to invade her space. She hadn't been worried about that. "My head just hurts." He kept staring at her, so she gave him a little more. "It was really loud there," she trailed off, shrugging a little, and he leaned in. "You should have told me, Pen." His voice wasn't reprimanding, but she still flinched a little. Immediately he leaned back. "Do you want to go back to the hotel and lay down for a few hours? No one will mind?" "No. That's okay. I promise, Mr. Stark. I'm fine." Her head gave a stab of pain then and she lowered her eyes. "Kid, when you're with me, I'm responsible for you. That means that if you're hurt or sick, I need to know." His next words were soft. "Careful. Do we need to call your aunt?" "No," she cried, speaking a little too loudly, then flushing. No, it's fine. We don't. I'm fine." "Really?" He stared at her for a moment, looking upset. Not angry. Worried. "I promise. It's just, it was loud there, and bright." He blinked at her, then nodded. Sensory overload. Penny nodded and he clapped his hands together. "All right, here's the deal. From now on, if you're with me, you tell me if you're not feeling well. If you're hurt or sick, because you're my intern and because I can help. Okay?" "Okay," she whispered, knowing that she was lying. Knowing that she couldn't tell him when she was hurt. Couldn't risk him finding out that she got hurt every week. Still, she nodded, and closed her eyes, resting her head on the window as Happy took them to the airport and hoping that she was a convincing liar.